when I came back from my break last time. Look, my hair is gone. It's not here anymore. I got it all. Well, not all of it, but I cut it off so I could donate it. Sent it into a organization called Hair We Share. I didn't do very much research on them, so don't like necessarily take this as an endorsement. It was just I I found them and I was like, all right, let's do that. I have my COVID hair. Let's put it to some good use. I I got my hair cut right before going to visit family for Thanksgiving, and then in conjunction with a work schedule change, delayed a little bit longer than I expected. But we are back. Actually, as I said that, I forgot. I need to turn on the fan. I am still here though. And since we are back, I figure we should do a return to form. I saw a video that seemed pretty intriguing, and it was a debate with Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. Alex O'Connor, of course, has been the subject of a couple of our debate reviews in the past. Or was it just one? At the very least, he is. We've seen him on stream before. Ben Shapiro we've talked about, but I don't know if we've actually heard anything from him. And this is almost guaranteed to be quite spicy. I started watching this on my own and then realized, you know what? Actually, this would be better to do on stream so we can all enjoy and benefit from this breakdown. So I do have a little bit. I've seen about the first half hour or so. No, not even. I think like 20 minutes. And I already have some thoughts, but I'll hold them for when we get there. Now they are debating whether religion is good or bad for society. Now, the format of this discussion seems to be very open. It seems to be exclusively a back and forth conversation. So I expect that the specific wording of this is going to be little less relevant. Now, strictly speaking, if we hold to that, then there's some stuff you could say, um, but it's mostly going to just be a discussion on religion, as a lot of these things tend to be. Toward that end, there are a few things to keep in mind. First is who's here. We'll start with Alex, because I like Alex, and I think he's very good at what he does. Unlike when we saw him in the veganism debate, I expect he will do very well here, because this is something at which Alex excels. It's not by any stretch the only thing that he is good at. He is quite a fellow who's great at a lot of stuff. I think I've mentioned before that I have no doubt that he will be considered, if he's not already, one of the great thinkers of this time. But he is also extremely good at conversations like this, ones where there is an expectation of civility. This isn't internet blood sports. We're not going to start yelling at each other. We're not going to hurl insults or whatever else. We're going instead to have this air of civility. He's very good at that. Alex keeps a cool head and is able to compose himself. I've never seen him like really flustered. I've seen him like exasperated sometimes. There was a instance where one of his guests stormed off in the middle of an interview. So, uh, in that case, there's a lot going on. He was clearly affected, but he kept his composure very easily. And we're gonna have a lot less volatility than that here. So there's going to be no concern as to whether he's going to come off as anything other than civil and intellectual. Great. He's also very good at measured philosophical argumentation, something that Ben is bad at. In fact, Ben is so bad at it, I was shocked that this debate was even happening. Ben is not a good debater. He is a good rhetorician. He is capable of appearing right to people who, in crass terms, don't know how to think, don't know how to understand argumentation, and he comes off as though he knows what he's talking about. He is thoroughly a bad faith interlocutor. He has admitted as much openly And when I say admitted as much, I mean he brags about it. He doesn't say it in those terms. In fact, he probably thinks that that's not what he's saying. But he has bragged about the only reason to debate or even be friends with, and not even be friends. That's almost exactly a quote from him. With someone on the left is to humiliate them publicly. This is obviously not good debate. It is merely rhetoric and the appearance of strength. This is maximally bad faith, and again, bragging about it. It's his advice on how to engage with the left. He has also bragged about his time at Harvard, where he refused to listen to what his professors said and instead wanted to, like, keep the ideology that he walked in with without learning more about the world, keeping his eyes and ears shut as much as possible. Bragged in a sense about being closed-minded, though not putting it that way, and has encouraged others to do the same. Ben is a bad faith interlocutor. If you don't know that, I don't know what to tell you. This is an introduction, and in which case you have to take my word for it. Otherwise, you can listen to him talk. If you'll notice, he doesn't do debates most of the time. He used to have people on his show that disagreed with him. That has diminished with time. And now he almost exclusively does these engagements where, he's debating with an audience member at a college who doesn't have control of the mic and can be made to leave at any moment. It is a position where it is impossible to succeed and only possible to not fail. But not failing is valuable in itself. This is pretty telling. I'm guessing he knows he can't debate. I don't know why this happened. Maybe it's maybe it's that Alex is a person where he wouldn't have a good excuse to decline the debate. I don't know if that's what he does. I don't want to imply that he just declines debates with people on the basis of, like, oh, they're too whatever. I don't know if he does that. But certainly Alex would be a person that he could not make such an accusation of if he were going to try. Maybe it's that uh, maybe it's that he thought he could handle it. Maybe it's that Alex is close enough to being college aged. He's not, but that he's like, maybe he doesn't know. I have no idea why he agreed to this. But here we are, and we're going to be talking about whether religion is good or bad for society. Now, I think that question is a little misguided. Whether I mean things can be good for society. Like, let's say we could prove that everyone holding the same delusion is good for society. That might be true, but I think there's an inherent value to truthfulness, where even if that were the case, if it were advantageous for a society to all believe that, I don't know, the sky is yellow, even if that were beneficial, I would think that it would be wrong to promote because it is false. And so you do have a little bit of, well, whether it's true seems to matter, whether the claims of religion are true seem to matter more than whether they're beneficial. That said, the question of whether it's good or bad for society, I think it is as likely to be good as, well, no, that's not even true. I think it is capable of being both good and bad contextually. I can imagine, and I have seen religious groups where clearly the religiosity is a benefit to those people and they clearly thrive, and there's no, like, real negative that happens other than it, at least to my mind, that they believe something that is untrue. However, we all know that it goes the other way as well, and it is my position that religion and religiosity is more likely to cause harm than to do good. We're asking an is statement, but I think the is a question of circumstance. Maybe in this present moment, religion isn't doing more harm than good. Okay, I don't know how you would determine that. But more important to me is whether this is something we can expect going forward. Maybe something could be good right now, but that is the fluke. This is something that people of my Political leaning will say is like, for, you know, American white people in the 1950s, capitalism was great. Everything was coming was fantastic, but not for everybody. Maybe like, and also not elsewhere, and not in the future. The question is whether it is a source of, it reliably will be good for society, and we can expect it to be good most of the time, more often than not, for most people, or into the future. You know, some combination of these factors. To which I think the answer is no. So let's see how they approach it. I know what their first topic of discussion is. I thought I remembered this being much longer a video. Let me double check that I have the right one here. Yeah, this is it. I could have sworn I saw this was a 2.5-hour video.
Pretty much universal.
So I thought we'd split it up. Maybe we will, depending on how we feel. But for the moment, we will simply watch and get through as much as we get through.
Science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us,
that
provide us social support,
I'm gonna
a huge place, and that mechanism that help people who...
Let's not spoil ourselves more than spoil
with today
that I've already done.
Roster of shows.
There's some
brought to you
introductions
in partnership with the Templeton Foundation, talking about a society. And I've been joined by two very dapper chaps.
I suppose. Oh, I forgot to mention, I do have tea again today. This is some ginger turmeric tea. I haven't tried it yet. I haven't tried it before. I am apprehensive. It is a very different... turmeric is a very different flavor than what I used to having in my teas, but it sounds like it could be good. So when it's cool enough to drink, I will do so.
Shapiro and Alex O'Connor, who some of you, most of you maybe, will be completely aware of. We're going to have a very substantive conversation. I'm going to introduce them first. I'm going to give a little summary on who they are, and stop me if you've heard this before.
I'm sure he'll say things that
Ben Shapiro is a prominent American conservative political commentator and columnist. Okay, so far?
So far, so good.
A graduate in political science from UCLA and the Harvard Law School, Ben has authored over a dozen books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great.
From what I've heard,
he is co-founder and editor.
And it's written by Ben Shapiro, so how good could it be? But I haven't read it myself, so I won't comment directly on the quality of that book, other than say, don't support Ben Shapiro anyway, even if the book's good.
Emeritus of The Daily Wire, and host of the aptly titled Ben Shapiro Show, which in 2021 was ranked in the top 10 most listened to Apple podcasts. He also has a YouTube channel with over 6 million subscribers.
Also,
kudos to you, sir.
Deeply sad and disappointed.
Joining Ben today is Alex O'Connor. Alex O'Connor is a YouTuber and host of the Within Reason podcast.
I'm a little surprised that he starts with YouTuber there, by the way. It's not super important, but like, I don't know. At least for my opinion of Alex, maybe it's because I hold him in high regard. I would introduce him as a philosopher and like include the YouTuber stuff, but it's not wrong. There's nothing bad about introducing him as a YouTuber.
The platform designed to present philosophical discussions in an accessible format. A graduate of philosophy and theology from St John's College, Oxford University, he is also an international public speaker and debater, having defended his philosophical convictions against a wide range of experts across multiple continents, and whose online video material has been viewed more than 70 million times.
That's kind of interesting.
Is that true?
It's kind of interesting, the difference in metrics. Again, it's not relevant at all, but to say, okay, Ben has 6 million subscribers on YouTube, and Alex has over 70 million views. It's just kind of funny of like, I think he didn't want to say like, okay, give a comparison of this one has more subscribers than the other. I have to imagine that Ben has far more subscribers than Alex, but that's just because of visibility and notoriety. And it's probably good on the moderator to just not have comparable metrics and instead talk up both speakers. It was just kind of funny to me when I heard it the first time.
It might be more now, actually, depending on
more than 70 million times.
That was written.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's great to have you both. Thank you both for taking the time. And for both of you, I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. So hopefully we're going to have a lot of good stuff
necessary in this
to say. We're talking about
to,
religion
nudge them
and
back
society
towards a relevant topic if
how
they
they
skew off
interconnect.
course.
And we want to know, really, and I'd like to get this settled once and for all at the end of this conversation so nobody else ever has to discuss it if we can. Is religion good for society? Can a society hold together if there are no underlying beliefs that everybody shares? And we're going to be exploring what both of you believe are the most important principles undergirding any civilization. What are the foundations of morality and ethics based on? So, without further ado, let's start. I'm not going to go into backstory too much because most people will be aware of who you are, and there'll be a lot of fanboys and girls out there watching. But let's talk about something that, Ben, you have spoken on, and Alex, you have responded to, this idea of the atheist delusion. Ben, could you...
Now, this, of course, okay, so the concept of the atheist delusion is transparently a religious, like, they got mad that Dawkins made a book called The God Delusion, and so they're like, it's the atheist delusion. It's nonsense, right? And it's born, well, we'll let him talk, but I know what he's about to talk about. It's born mostly of people ascribing specific beliefs to atheism that are not necessary. Atheism, as you recall, is merely the non-belief in a god. If when asked the question, do you believe in God, the answer is no. That is not the same thing as saying that you believe there is no God, and therefore does not require any specific outlook on the world. You can even believe in supernatural stuff and be an atheist, though I would consider that a little weird, right? You could theoretically believe in fairies, I guess, but those wouldn't be gods, right?
Concisely, if you can, talk about what you mean by the atheist delusion.
Sure. So I should start off by saying I don't actually think that it's possible to prove the existence of God. I'm also not a believer that you can disprove the existence of God.
So we're already off the bat, again, because I've already seen this part, I know what he's using this for, so I'm just going to comment right away. We're already seeing him lay the groundwork to wiggle out of arguments, which is to say, it appears as though he is acknowledging his propensity for doubt, his ability to doubt and to be uncertain, because that gives an air of like you're more open-minded. We know, of course, that he's not. He is unshakable from the position that there is a God and that he knows that. To pretend otherwise is, as I say, to pretend. But what he's doing is he is giving himself the opportunity to say, well, I can't prove it, so to insist that I have to is like you being over strenuous or like over demanding. And so he can wiggle out of any proof claims. It's to dodge the burden of proof. And then also, as we're about to see, to contrast
I don't think that logical argumentation is going to get you there one way or another. And so I'm not going to try and do that with Alex today, because I think that if people would have been able to provide dispositive proofs, then people would believe them.
By the way, this argument should be over. You can't prove it's real. We shouldn't believe things that aren't real. We can move on now. The only way that he could possibly proceed is to say it is good for people to believe things that they cannot prove to be true, which is a kind of interesting statement from Mr. Facts don't care about your feelings. I'm sorry, we should believe things that are true, and we should try to disbelieve things that are not true. And if we can't demonstrate something to be true, we should at best be skeptical, but more often not believe it until it is demonstrated.
People were able to provide dispositive proofs that God does not exist, then people would be more apt to believe those as well. What I think is an atheist delusion is that it is possible to live ideologically purely in a way that does not rely on fundamental faith principles.
Do you see the problem? What about atheism requires you to live ideologically purely? The question is only, do you think that God is real? And you say no. It's also off topic. We're talking about whether religion is good or bad for society. Now, this is kind of on the moderator because he prompted the discussion of the atheist delusion, so we're already off topic. But this is kind of what I mean about, we're just going to be talking vaguely about religion for the duration. But also, he's going to make a couple of assumptions about what he means by assuming faith principles that just do not follow.
When I say faith principles, I'm not going to make the claim that those faith principles are direct from Sinai, or that those faith principles require the New Testament, for example. I'm going to make the claim that there are a bunch of principles upon which we base ourselves that are external to what we know about nature and evolutionary biology, and that many of the things that Alex does in his daily life, for example, are going to be things that rely on principles that are external to a philosophy that would assume a lack of the supernatural, a lack of the extra natural.
So again, the argument that atheists assume the lack of the supernatural, they simply say we simply say we do not believe it is real. But now he's assuming and declaring it a positive claim that these things are not true to shift the burden of proof.
So some of those principles, for example, are free will. So every day we get up, we believe, virtually all of us, whether we say we believe it or not, we actually
like
act in ways that betray the idea that we believe that we have control over our own actions, at least to a.
So now we're going to get into discussion of free will, and you see Alex smiling a little because he's discussed this a lot of times. But notice how Ben is approaching the argument. We believe that we do this. He hasn't claimed that it's even real, that free will is even a thing. Just we believe it, so therefore, and now he's going to ask, how can you get free will without God?
A certain extent, and that control makes a difference in the world. And that's what gives us purpose. It's what allows us to wake up in the morning and make the decision to do what we believe is right or what we believe is wrong. That the principles of right and wrong are external to evolutionary biology. So both of these principles that I've mentioned already, free will,
And
right
again,
and wrong.
this is that, like, religious people love to say that, like, evolutionary biology has to be the source of everything for the atheist. It's just not the case. It's simply the mechanism by which our species came to be and all other species. It is not a requisite source of all things that we come up with.
These come from a language that is external to the Darwinian language of evolutionary biology. If you're talking about free will, there is nothing in nature that suggests the ability to make a decision free of environment and genetics in combination.
And I just disagree with that flatly. There's what requisites would be required for free will to come about naturally, and why are those impossible to come about through natural means? What does that even mean? What would you need to be able to have free will? Clearly, biological processes produce the ability to have consciousness. Now, Ben would say that is also like you need a god for that, but that's just a claim without evidence, right? He's just saying that, but he hasn't demonstrated. He wouldn't be able to demonstrate that. Now, I happen to agree with Alex, and I'll let him speak before I say that I agree with him. But just like note, there are just a million flaws with what Ben is saying.
In some sort. The same thing is true of right and wrong, the idea that there is a right and there is a moral wrong that we can reason our way to. Another principle that I think that you're obviously very big on, it's something that you rely on all the time, your entire podcast is based on the idea of reason. These ideas do not exist in the context of a purely materialist atheist universe.
So this is true if and only if you presume that things like reason are things that are created by people and not is invented or whatever, and not the result of observation. The idea of causality, it's not that we came up with it and like it exists separate from the universe. I would argue instead that it is something we observe. We see that when you push a ball off a hill, it rolls down the hill. We notice that thing causes thing. It's an observation. And that observation, that idea of causality, you can call it existent in the universe just naturally, or you can say we have simply put name to an observation, to a tendency we have noticed. That's very possible naturalistically.
Now, I'm not going to make the claim that I can prove that it's God who's behind those things, because one of the principles of faith belief is that I don't understand God. So for people who don't believe in God, that's an easy way out, right? That's an easy way out for people like me, because I say, well, I don't have to explain the relationship between God and free will.
I can just wave my hand and say it works. You have to prove a thing. He's just dodging the burden of proof.
Well, because frankly, I don't fully understand God. But that's not really that's not really an open window. That's just part of pretty much all faith systems, is that if my mind were the mind of God, then I would either be God or God would not exist, one of the two things.
And of course he's lying here, right? Like he while he'll pretend, like while he'll say like, oh, like it's all fuzzy and there's that or whatever, again, he will say, yes, there is a God and we should orient our lives in some regard based on the fact that that is true. So he clearly doesn't think that, oh, it's maybe. He's saying like, no, that must be the case. And in fact, with Ben specifically, who argues publicly for political changes to be in accordance with Judeo-Christian values, a nonsense term that I won't get into, is saying it says by doing so, is explicitly making efforts to change the world to be in accordance with these things that he merely believes is true, and according to him in this conversation, doesn't know to be true. No, you think you know it's true, Ben.
So the idea that reason makes a difference in our lives, that we can reason our way to propositions, and that's more than just saying a few magic words and that's setting off a few neurons in somebody else's brain in a naturalistic way. That they're actually
so again, and now he's straw manning what a naturalistic position would be. I would argue that the mechanism by which these changes occur can be a completely physical one. Things cause effects, right? So when you hear the vibrations caused by my voice making these sounds, your neurons and whatever react in predictable and knowable ways. Now those are extremely complex when it comes to why you can understand in some regards what these sounds are and not others, and so on and so forth. Like, and in what ways. That's incredibly complex, but it isn't magic. It is the opposite of magic. It is the reaction of things based on other things. No different than a ball being pushed down a hill.
Is principles of truth, another concept that comes from the extra natural world. That these principles exist. So far I've mentioned free will. Good.
Oh, and this is something that, like, of course Ben will do, but religious interlocutors, will do all the time, and that is to accuse the atheist in magical thinking as they're literally trying to argue for the existence of a magical sky daddy.
Wrong. Reason and truth, right? All things that we consider extremely key in our daily lives, and that Alex considers key in what he does. It's, I assume, why you get up every morning, or at least why you feel you get up every morning. You know, what gets you up?
And I'll give you a moment.
Do your podcast.
I'll wait for
it's
Alex
because you want to say things that you believe are reasonable, are going to convince people to act in a better way, or I assume not a worse way, that get people to change their lives in some way, in a self-motivated fashion. That's not merely in a sort of Pavlovian response to circumstance and environment. So if I were going to talk about the atheist delusion, that's what I would suggest is the delusion, that an atheist can use terminology that is drawn from a world that is external to atheism for itself.
So this is something that he hinted at before, but as I'm making more explicit, this is what I was saying where it just doesn't follow, which is the idea that things like logic and like free will, I guess. Though I disagree with the free will thing. More it's like logic here, require a god to exist, and this is merely a thing that apologists have decided is the case recently. And I say recently, it's within the last several decades or something. But why? Like, why is that the case? I've never once heard any of them make an argument as why that must be the case, other than to assert another claim which they couldn't prove, which is that it is impossible for evolution to create by evolutionary processes for beings to come to be that are capable of reason. They just say it's impossible, but why? The only reason is so that they can claim ownership over the concept of reason. Hilarious for a religious apologist.
And again, that's not an argument for God, even. That's just an argument against atheism. Again, I think the arguments against God are...
And notice, argument against atheism, that is not possible. Because atheism is not the claim that God does not exist. It is the claim that I do not believe in God. That you have not demonstrated the position that God is real sufficiently. So you can't... To argue against that must be to argue for the existence of God. But, of course, that's not how it's... That's not what people do. That's not what people like Ben will do. Because, obviously, it's much harder to assume a burden of proof for something that's unprovable than to invent a position for your opponent and then dismantle it.
Are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. This is one of the things that I've said to Sam Harris, and I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious.
Another lie that I see constantly from religious people: oh, religious people have doubts, but atheists don't. It's literally the opposite. Ben, you personally believe that God is so real that you should orient your life around the things that in a book that allegedly came from God, and that society should also be oriented towards compliance with those doctrines. You do not have doubt in any meaningful way. However, an atheist got to being where they are by questioning the exact thing you refuse to. that is doubt. Now, there are degrees. Most of the people you'll debate with are atheists to the point of, I think it's unlikely to the point of impossibility that there is a God. And at that point, sure, I'm pretty comfortable saying I think there is no God, but that is not what it means to be an atheist. And certainly atheists have doubts, myself included.
In this way than many of the people who are God believers.
Well, something's certain. We don't do cold opens or soft starts here on the big conversation. Alex.
Well, I am glad to begin on a point of agreement with you, Ben, that yes, if there is no God, there is no free will.
I'd like to note, by the way, that him immediately beginning with, hey, we're in agreement, is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that Alex excels in conversations like this. He immediately begins with, we're merely discussing. I can agree with you on things, even though I disagree with you. It's tiny, but it's the exact kind of approach that a conversation like this, well, that is good in a conversation like this, and he does it, effortlessly.
That's because of the truth of this, of the latter of those.
And what he agrees with.
I suppose the biggest criticism that I made of you in a video response that I made to the atheist delusion, and this show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So thanks again.
By the way, I should say it's a great video, and everybody should watch it if they haven't.
Well, I'm going to put that in the description. I think that glowing endorsement. The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle or not so subtle implication, in my view, that yes, with no God, there's no free will. But somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence, such that in order to either say that there is free will, in order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God. And
so what Alex is saying, in case it was a little unclear, is that Ben is saying there is such a thing as free will, and he got clarification that Ben does in fact think that. Now, he didn't say that because, of course, Ben doesn't want to make any positive claims that he'll have to defend, because asking him to demonstrate there is such a thing as free will would be impossible, but it's necessary for him. And then hid in there the implication, well, because he went on at length about how without a God there can be no free will. Yeah, you are arguing that there is a God, and you're claiming that while simultaneously saying that you're the one with doubts where atheists have none. No, you're saying definitively you believe it's demonstrable that there is a God in this exact way, but of course you haven't demonstrated the truth of your premise. You've simply implied the argument without actually stating it. Now, Alex, of course, isn't being so inflammatory as I am. He isn't making that accusation, but he is pointing out that, like, Ben, no, you did kind of make an argument for the existence of God, even though you claim not to, and that it's pretty relevant to say, well, there must. Yeah, I don't remember if he goes on to say that, well, you would have to demonstrate that there is free will, wouldn't you? And that a God could solve the problem that of free will that you ascribe to a godless world, which Alex goes on a little bit more about.
And that does strike me
as
an argument for God's existence.
I mean, to slightly curve that, or to kind of sand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural.
Sure.
Now you can
right,
call that
and so now he's again, like, he doesn't want to make an argument, so he backs up and he's like, well, it's just something supernatural. I'm not saying it's God necessarily, because he knows he can't defend the position, and he doesn't want to try to defend positions here. He wants to be on the attack. So he's not going. So he's going to back it up and be like, well, no, it's not an argument for God, just like something beyond a strictly materialist world, which I am saying atheists must definitely believe in, and therefore this is a problem. He wants it only to be an attack.
God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will. That is not possible. So
this is where, because Alex is about to say something different, this is where I am going to diverge from Alex a little bit. While I generally, and I think what Alex is about to say is correct, and I think it is more defensible than this alternative, I think it would be possible for there to be free will in a materialist world, based mostly on some of the randomness that we seem to observe in particle physics. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand particle physics as I understand, or as I have heard. There's I think it's Richard Feynman has a quote. It's like, anyone who thinks they understand particle physics doesn't understand particle physics, and I'm not educated on it. I've merely listened to lecturers talk about it in a way that is accessible to lay people such as myself. However, I have heard on multiple occasions about these, at the very least, seemingly random occurrences about particles popping into and out of existence, about doing things that should be impossible as long as they're not being observed, so on and so forth. What appear to be violations of laws of physics, though they may not be, it may simply be things we do not understand yet. But if they are at some level random, that can be a way by which that randomness that exists in the universe opens the avenue for events that are not causal. And when you associate those events that are not causal with thinking, which these events happen within our own brains as well, we call that free will. I think that's possible, though I think way less defensible than Alex's position, which I think is more likely, and I'll let him say it.
Possible. So I know that the way you solve that
I think he says it
is
right
that
now,
you say
but
that there
if
is
he
no
doesn't,
free
he'll
will.
say it in a
That's
minute
right.
too.
And what I'm saying to you is you don't act that way.
I hear this all the time. People say, look, you may say there's no free will, but you don't act as though that's the case. I
guess he doesn't say
suppose that
just
I'm
yet.
just confused as to what it would look like for somebody to act as if they believe there was no free will.
That's
I
also
mean,
a
the
good
very
point.
argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will. And that you are essentially just a biological machine reacting to its to its internal and evolutionary drives.
So for clarity, because Alex said that in a very sophisticated way. I think he said it in a very eloquent way. We'll bring it down to dummies like me. Basically, the quote that he was citing, that you can do what you will, but you can't will what you will, is the idea that we are, like all other things, subject to causality. Things affect us, and we are affected by them, and then what we do is in some way reflective of the things that have occurred to us. There's no, kind of like what Ben was saying, like in the world where we understand, if we understood all of physics and the starting place of everything would have to go the way that it did with no variation, because that's what things do when they're affected in the way that they are. And there's no reason why that should cease to be the case with living organisms. In a purely materialistic sense, there's not really a distinction between a conscious being and a non-conscious object or being, right? Both are subject to cause and effect in the same way. This is the reason why, if someone stubs their toe, they wince in pain and maybe bleed or have a bruise or something. It's the same thing. A thing occurred, there was a response, and that can translate all the way up to what we consider higher consciousness. And we don't think of it that way because we want to feel like we choose the things we do. But as that quote was saying, you can do what you will, but you can't will what you will. What it is that you want at some level, in this argument would say, is caused by things that came before that are out of your control. This is slightly borne out in some studies that I've heard about, one of which is people were asked to, they were told there are two buttons, you can pick whichever one you want and push them, or neither, just as soon as you're given as soon as you're told to do, that you can make that choice. And then they do, but their brains are being monitored, and it was noticed that the decision to make the choice occurred well before they thought they made it, kind of implying that there was something out of their control. That we don't really choose the things we choose. we simply believe that we do, that free will is in a sense an illusion. I think that is a much more defensible argument than the one I proposed prior, though I think it is at the very least an interesting consideration. And with that in mind, Alex can say, okay, without God there can be no free will, but I don't think there's free will. So there's no problem. There's no delusion.
That's what's happening. Now, call that nihilistic if you like, that's a separate question, but as to the question of how this would make one act, the idea that this might cause us to sort of lay around in bed all day or something, the very mechanism that I think is responsible for eliminating the possibility of free will, that is, the drives that make people do what they do, like I say, do exactly that. Make people do what they do. They make them get out of bed in the morning.
Exactly. So if you were to say, well, if nothing I do can be willed, why don't I just stay in bed all day? Well, one, that question presumes that you have a choice in the matter, that it is in fact that you do have the will to make the distinction between what you do. But if you were to lay in bed all day and think, what is the point? What is the point of anything? I can't will whatever. That is no different a caused response than if you were to say, well, I choose to go on anyway. This is a bit, this actually reminds me a bit of something that I got a surprising amount of flack on from a previous video when I said that there is kind of a beauty in resisting, in witnessing the grand crushing nothingness of the universe and saying I matter anyway. In the same way, I agree it makes the most sense that free will is an illusion, but I will go on anyway. This, by the way, is not a truth statement. It is an aesthetic one. So in case people want to get mad at me about that one again, it's not an argument. Yeah, right.
Why do you get out of bed and go and make your breakfast if there's no free will?
So
you go and get breakfast because there's no free will and something is driving you to do that that's outside of your control.
For sure. So to get back to the nihilism point, which you kind of put aside, so that means that this conversation is essentially worthless in any sort of real sense. I mean, effectively, we were driven here by evolutionary biology and environment to have this conversation. Everybody who's watching this is driven.
So this is like the misunderstanding that I hear often in response to this, because this is a jarring argument to hear that maybe you don't have free will. This is like, oh, then what's the point of doing something like this if we're all, well, it's not that things will happen no matter what. It's that things have effects. And those effects include the effects of our responses to those things. So the purpose of having a conversation like this does not change whether people have free will. The only difference is the mechanism. It is not that people decide and their minds have changed by their will. It is instead that it is a causal relationship between having heard these arguments and these positions that in a sense does not require their conscious will to have their mind changed. People are affected by things, man.
By evolutionary biology.
This, of course, but this, by the way, is kind of funny because it's something I've remarked about right-wing thinking in the past. I really don't think that people on the right believe in causality when it comes to people. There's been, I'm not going to go too much into it right now, but I've seen a pretty significant amount of that people like Ben will argue for like personal responsibility while also believing that the things they do cannot have effects on what other people do, or should not have effect on the people like that. This is why they complain about getting banned from websites. It's like personal responsibility. What happened to that? Well, it's because they don't believe that their actions can change how people regard them.
And environment to have a particular reaction to that thing, and ever round the cycle goes. That seems like a very purposeless life. Maybe again, I'm drawing from a realm that is not evolutionarily.
But like, notice the argument, right? It's a purposeless life. What's the impact? We've talked about impacts before. It's why this matters. Well, the impact is, well, that's because it would mean we have no purpose. Okay, maybe we don't. Is that uncomfortable for you? That doesn't make it wrong. Facts don't care about your feelings, Ben. I don't know what to tell you.
Biologically, connected. The word purpose is really, teleology obviously has been taken out of the realm of science pretty thoroughly by atheists and by many people in the sciences, although I would argue that again, most scientists speak in the realm of teleology literally all the time, and they're
Yes.
borrowing language from the language of teleology, even when
I
they're
forget. I thought he. I forget exactly what teleology means. The explanation of phenomena in terms of purpose they serve, rather than causes by which they arise. So this would be. Remember. Oh, I actually haven't talked about this on the channel yet. There's basically like two kinds of why. There's how come and what for. I forget who I got that from, but basically, how come is the causal reason. You know, what caused this thing? How did it come to be? And then there's the what for, which is for what reason did this occur? It'd be kind of like if a kid pushes another kid on the playground, you can say, why did you do that? And they can say, well, it's because my arm extended and that caused a force into their back and caused them to fall over. That is, in a sense, a how come, how did that come to be? That is a why. But the question actually being asked is for what purpose? And we use why to mean either. Teleology is specifically focused on the what for as opposed to how come.
describing functions of particular body parts, right? The heart pumps blood in order to
Right.
keep you alive, right? They're constantly using
Oh,
language that's
kind of
teleological in nature.
Well, yeah, kind of.
The real question that I have, and this is what goes to the question that you were asking at the beginning, before the sort of pre-question question, which was the good of religion to society. One of those goods is people believing that their free will matters and this actually is a useful thing. So
This is what I was talking about, but the specific terms of the question being kind of weird to me because I knew I had seen it at least this far. Ben goes to say, well, it seems to be a good for society to believe for people to believe they have free will, irrespective of whether they do or not, and that religion, at least in his view, is a requisite for belief in free will. Then, therefore, religion does a good by convincing people of several delusions that make society function. But the question, of course, is, well, is that worthwhile? Is the truth less important than that? I mean, this again is really weird. The facts don't care about your feelings, guys. Say we should ignore the facts because people feel like they need this. That said, this is also why it can be valuable to have an argument such as the one I presented, which gives possibility to the idea of free will without necessity of a God. And by the way, God doesn't solve this problem either. Alex goes on to talk about this, but we'll get there when we get there.
believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology.
Oh, and by the way, I love Christopher Hitchens' quote when asked about this. Because on the topic of free will, he would say, people ask me if I believe we have free will, and I say, yes, because I have no choice. Which is a joke, right? But, like, it's kind of there. Like, there's not really a way that you could behave. Like Alex was saying, there's not really a way you could behave if you thought you didn't have free will that would be distinguishable from thinking that you do. We kind of just have to assume that we do and progress as though that's the case. And whether we do or not it kind of doesn't matter, you know?
would drive them to. So you say, well, it's biology that drives you to get out of bed in the morning, which is almost Calvinist in sort of the way that it's described, right? It's like you're predestined to get out of bed in the morning, so thus you get out of bed in the morning. But the reality is that we are constantly making decisions as though those decisions make a difference in the universe. And what social science actually does tend to show is that when people believe that they have control over their own actions, that when they believe that they're capable of changing the way that they live, they do make those changes with more alacrity and in better directions than if they don't believe that. If people tend to believe in a deterministic universe, they do act worse. So it may work. This is going to be sort of...
So, I mean, that's just an unsubstantiated claim. I would be surprised if that were the case. Mostly because Ben said it, and usually when he talks about stuff that's demonstrable, it's either miscited or flatly wrong, but it doesn't really matter. We'll proceed.
Straussian in its implications, but that may work for you. You're a very high IQ individual who can somehow reconcile the idea of living a very purposeful life with the idea that actually there's no purpose to anything. But for the vast majority of people...
Well, kind of, because this is what I was getting at before. I can say that I give myself purpose, and that is good enough. I don't need more than that. And that can be, for myself, more powerful than the overwhelming nothingness of the universe saying otherwise. It comes from within, and that's good enough.
That is not actually how they live. And I would suggest that even in your daily life, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, man, my biology is driving me this morning to get on the bike, have a great day. The sun is shining. That's my biology doing this. And I don't think that most people who
Okay,
live
but you don't have to.
purposeful lives, even if they believe that everything they're doing is predetermined by the world around them, by their own biology, I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to
we withdraw
feel
into the illusion,
a
but that
sense
doesn't make
of
it
purpose
true.
and meaning in their lives.
Of course, but that's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide precisely that illusion. I mean, it's not as that. I mean, you say, look, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, gosh, look at my biological
My neurons are
drive.
firing, yeah.
Of course not, because if I did, then
I do,
the
by
whole
the way.
evolutionary purpose that this illusion serves would fall away. I mean, you say that this is a fairly purposeless life, and perhaps the implication is that it's a bit of a depressing one. I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the
succeeded,
case.
by the way.
Yeah,
It is in fact
right.
the
Because the question, like for Alex, is what we can demonstrate and what we can believe to be true, but like Ben is insisting on believing a delusion, which is a choice.
case that free will doesn't exist, and we may feel very nihilistic towards that, but as a wise man once said, facts don't care about your feelings.
Hell yeah, get him.
And I will say that the argument against free will, in my view, is based upon something broader than just scientific analysis or empirical research.
Okay, this is completely off topic, but we'll derail and like have a little bit of a breather. I always see that they always have water with them, and I know a lot of it's been edited, but the conversation seems to flow as though portions haven't been cut out. But I never see them drink any, and in fact, the water always seems to be at the same level at the start and end. Which, okay, fine, maybe they didn't drink any water, but I'm sitting here like I can't. You see me, I'm talking the whole time. I can't go without drinking for an hour, 2 hours, like even a little bit here and there, especially talking this much. Your mouth gets dry. I don't know how they do it. I don't know. Maybe these are like magic, hydro people that don't need additional hydration this frequently. I don't know. It's something it's tiny, but it's always confused me.
Rather, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic. The proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. Now, this law of the excluded middle, one of the foundational precepts of philosophy, we can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity, and this will be regardless of whether it's material
I guess
or...
Ben has a mug of something also, so maybe he's drinking from that one we don't see, but like the other glasses of water, we'll see if they drink. I'm gonna keep an eye on it. All right. We're gonna play a sub game, see if anyone drinks out of these. But I never see it in any interview or conversation like this.
Immaterial. That's what makes this a crucial argument, and an important one, a pertinent one, is that you can ask of that mental activity, is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind or inside your brain or indeed inside your soul, or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, I should say yourself rather than your brain here to rid this conversation of any implicit materialism, exterior to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate?
So
Indeterminate, it's random. Determined, you keep going back until you either terminate in something outside of the self, something, or I suppose something undetermined and therefore random, either of which you are completely out of control in. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this. They say, well, look, with a religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul. That doesn't solve anything. Because
Okay, so I think he's mostly done with the argument. I don't want to like let it go too long without comment, but I should explain a little bit what this argument is because it is kind of a complex one, so I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Basically, he's arguing that free will is impossible with or without God because there are two choices. Either something is determined or it is not. If it is not determined by anything at all, then it's completely random, and that's certainly not free will. And if it is determined by something, it must be determined by something aside from you or from within you. If it's aside from you, it's exactly the view that Ben was pushing back on, that everything is simply caused and you make no decisions, and that's certainly not free will. And it's coming from within you, well, then you just you ask that same question again. Okay, you can talk about why did Ben do this thing, and then say, well, his brain decided to do the thing. Okay, but why did his brain decide to do the thing? And you go back and back until you must arrive again. It was caused by something, in which case it is not free will, or it was caused by nothing, in which case it was random and still not free will. And so Alex is basically saying God doesn't solve the problem either. I know Ben is backed up to saying like something, supernatural instead of God specifically, but it doesn't solve any of those problems. The only way that God can solve that problem is to wave your hand, say magic, and go, I don't know, it's a mystery, but it does work, I guess, trust me. But that's not really an argument, and it's not really, it's merely declaring that this deductively sound argument is wrong because I said so. That's about it.
Because you still need to. It's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery, but if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
Well,
And so he makes it clear what his conclusion is. By the way, this is why even 15 minutes in, you can see the quality of Alex's argumentation. This is why I was so upset with him in that veganism debate where we watched him, and his arguments were utter dog shit. I couldn't believe it. It was tough for me to believe it was the same person. That's how different it was. And so this is what I mean. Like, he is clearly very intelligent, very capable, very, very well studied, and very good at explaining his ideas. And yet, I don't know what happened before.
So I would be careful.
That argument does rely on the complete deconstruction of the self.
It doesn't.
You're using
by the way.
the term self in this argument in, I think, a couple of different ways. You're saying something outside yourself, but then you're breaking down the self into a bunch of separate components as though the self is a computer. Right? As though if you took the self and you broke it down into a machine, and there's like
to argue that the self has no component parts is kind of weird. Like, okay, then fine, it has no component parts, but then if it comes from the self, then that's it doesn't matter for his argument, right? Because Alex was saying at some point you get to a level at which this thing is, you can't go back any further, and yet here it is. This must be determined or not. It does not matter, Ben.
There's the microchip, and you've got the processor, you've got all these different parts of it. So it has to be coming from here, or it has to be coming from here. But I think the very idea that we have of ourselves as selves is as a deciding being. And so the attempt to carve that down.
So notice that's a claim without justification. It's just, he is by fiat claiming that the self, to be the self, must be a deciding being. He's just assuming the conclusion. It's just
so which parts of the deciding being?
This is what I mean. He's a terrible.
That is an avoidance strategy.
Terrible argumentation.
So I don't think that the argument quite holds.
Well, if we can call the self just a deciding
being.
being,
Call it a deciding being.
then
I mean, you can call
that
it that,
sort of fundamental assumption that we make about the nature of the self, I don't think is going to be incompatible with atheism.
How so?
Because we're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in this?
So he finds it difficult to believe because he lumps in a bunch of things in that category of like reason and free will, and like I am declaring this impossible without religious belief, but there's nothing about the concept of the self that is impossible in an atheist worldview. If I were to define the self, I would say it is the bounds of your consciousness, which that requires nothing supernatural to understand or to be a concept that is possible to discuss.
The self is a series of
and by the way, I understand that
of non-deciding mechanisms, as you've described. I see that your view of the self is an atheist view of the self, a meatball wandering through space, as I've put it somewhat colorfully, the sort of Spinoza idea that you're a stone that's been thrown, and you can comprehend that you've been thrown, but you're a stone that's been thrown, and that's just the way that it is.
Yeah, and that, by the way, Spinoza, like, that he said that is evidence of his brilliance. But if you don't know, Spinoza's, I'm pretty sure he's long dead now. It was a philosopher. But that's kind of the thing I was saying earlier, right? The idea of there is no free will, of like it is no different than a ball rolling down a hill, or in the Spinoza term, you are a stone who has been thrown. You are on your trajectory, and it might feel like you make choices about it, but do you really? I have also used the analogy of a computer in the past. If we could imagine computers were sentient, right? Not that they're like not AI, but like are just aware of their own processes. They might imagine that the things that they do are decisions they have made. Well, I have chosen to open up this web browser and YouTube and chosen to connect with the internet and whatever else. But but is that the case? Well, no, right? There's something external to them that is causing that. Or, even if you're looking on a smaller scale and you're not assuming the outside element, they might say, well, I've decided to run this process, then this process, then this process, but that's only because that's what's necessary to open Chrome, which was the thing that was happening.
Why would there be in atheist philosophy such a thing as a deciding self? The deciding being is external to the idea of an evolutionary.
Oh, right, I
cause.
forgot. So like that's what I guess that's part of why he thinks the self is impossible, because he's defining by fiat that the self is a deciding being, and so he's saying, well, atheists don't think you can decide, so therefore you can't believe in the self. But obviously that definition of the self is not like that's not typically the definition people use. Certainly not philosophers. That's not like, yeah, when people say the self, that's definitely what they mean.
Because the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision making, and you've just excluded it through your own philosophy.
That's also not true. The term deciding means uncaused decision making, does it? When you decide things, do you decide them for no reason, or do you have reasons? It's not random. You definitely have reasons when you do it. The only argument that Alex is making here, and I think is a very good one, is that decision is like the reasons for why certain things seem compelling to you and not others, and why you thought of certain things and not others. That just wasn't in your control, but it is caused no less than anything else.
Caused decision making, I suppose, is a concept that I think is unintelligible, and therefore, if there is an unintelligibility of the self
I think that
on
we've passed the
atheism,
point where
I
I've seen,
suppose
by the way.
the thrust of the criticism that I made to essentially every point you made in that video, except for the argument from motion, is that what you're saying to me, if it applies to atheism, I think simultaneously applies to theism as well.
How so?
An uncaused decision. I mean, what is the process by which a decision is made?
But now you're falling into the same sort of
Oh, no, I
argument
saw a
that
little
I
process.
excluded at the beginning, which was, I said that the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand.
Yeah, this is exactly what I meant. It's because I knew he was going here that I was saying what I did at the beginning. He's just dodging his requirement to prove any of his positions. He can just say, "Oh, I don't have to, I know there's a lot of stuff I don't understand, but you have to prove everything."
So I can't explain to you how the
It's
uncaused
cowardly and
self makes
dishonest.
decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheistic
But you have a
framework.
burden and I don't.
See,
Meaning that
exactly,
that's the-
exactly. But you have a burden and I don't. That's the only reason he's done that. Maybe not the only reason, but that's the primary reason why he's done this. It's so that he can dodge any responsibility he has to prove his position. He wants to assume it as the default and then require the atheist to prove a negative.
It's the case.
You do, though. I mean, the simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable materialist universe is the cause of all. And
No,
so
he didn't. He didn't claim that, actually. He simply said that there's no. First of all, he hasn't made a comment on it, but he would say there's no reason to assume that a god is necessary for it, which isn't the same claim. But he's putting words in his mouth. Notice again the straw manning. He does this constantly. Alex is definitely able to handle it, so it's not like a worry as to whether he'll be able to avoid these pitfalls. But Ben does this to literally everyone he talks to.
if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not. My entire philosophy rests on the positing of an entire realm of things I don't understand in terms of their interaction with the world. Now, as I said
But you
at the very
think are
beginning,
definitely
that leaves
real,
me a
and you
giant
definitely
escape
believe,
hatch.
and you can definitely know that they're the case, and we should definitely orient our lives around it. Yeah, you're lying.
I'm not going to pretend that that's not a giant escape hatch. It acts in practice as a giant escape hatch.
Now
It
he's
also
admitting
tends
to
to
it.
act as a fundamental principle of faith, right? Again, in every
It's also
moral
not
realm,
a fundamental
right?
principle of
When
faith,
it gets
by
to the
the
problem
way.
of good and evil, right? One of the big questions.
In Judaism, there's a lot more of like, yeah, you should question everything, and including questioning your own faith can be a good thing. So I don't. I'm not going to say that Judaism doesn't have that, but like every Christian, a lot of Christian denominations certainly are like, no, your faith must be unwavering and resolute and yada yada,
is, well, how can God allow evil to take place in the world? And the fundamental religious answer, as it has been for thousands of years, is my mind is not God's, which is a giant escape hatch. It also happens to be true from
the answer, of course, is I don't know the answer, but it's not a problem. Don't worry about it. It's basically there can be no challenges to religion. It's another mechanism of self-sealing belief.
religious point of view.
So if I may, that there are two sort of escape hatches here. There are two appeals to mystery going on here. And it seems to me that what you're saying is something along the lines of my simple appeal to mystery here is disallowed in the way that you're allowed to appeal to this mystery because I'm the one making the claim. I think that
not because I'm the one making the claim, but because
I'm the one with the burden.
In
the context of this,
there's a little bit of
I'm
confusion there, but Ben does not actually disagree.
The I in
yes,
a sense, but yes,
I see what you mean. I'm speaking for myself there.
Sorry.
If in the context of this discussion, this began the subject which I think is the first one you bring up in this video, free will. Here's this thing that I think exists, and on the basis of its existence, think entails the existence of a God, or at least points to the existence of a God. I shouldn't say entail. And then when I say that I don't think that the concept of free will is intelligible, and you say, well, how is it intelligible on atheism? And I say, I'm not sure it is, but it's not on theism either. And you say, well, there's my escape hatch. I can appeal to mystery. I don't think the burden is on me there. I think you were the one who's making the claim that free will does exist, that there is this mysterious property of the universe.
Actually, that's not
escapes.
true.
So I always want to comment, but of course Alex is very good at expressing his position. We'll reword it in case it's unclear. But basically, he's saying is like, well, we both have this problem. You're the only one who says that there is definitely free will, and so no, you do have a burden. You have the burden of proof, that no matter how much you want to try to dodge it. And of course, Ben's going to try to wiggle out of it again.
This determined or indetermined dichotomy, and then when I say that this is unintelligible to me, and based on what I see to be fundamentally appeal to a law of logic, suddenly I'm the one making the claim. I'm the one with the burden who has to do the proving.
No, the actual claim that I originally made, if you recall, was a conditional claim.
Mm-hmm.
I did not claim free will exists, therefore God. I claimed
You
if you
implied
believe
it
free will
strongly.
exists, it cannot exist in a materialist universe. Now,
Sure.
you say,
and now Alex has said it doesn't exist. So what burden does he have?
okay, fine, it doesn't exist in a materialist universe. I don't believe in free will.
Yes.
That's fine. That's totally plausible, as I said right at the top here. I'm not going to prove to you that God exists
What burden
today.
does he have?
What I am going to say is that the vast majority of people throughout
now he
nearly
shifts
all
the
of human
topic.
history have believed.
So to be clear, he is completely lost on this point. He has even admitted he was wrong in different words, but he has basically made an argument. Alex was like, well, okay, but I don't believe that there is such a thing as free will, so it's fine. Claimed that he needs to demonstrate that because he has a burden to do so, and then was soundly rebuffed on, no, I don't. And now he's backing up to, well, most people believe that there's free will. I don't care. It doesn't matter what most people believe. The question is whether it's there or not. And if most people believe it's there, that's a different thing.
Believe there is a thing called a self. It is a deciding self that makes these decisions. If you are a person who believes that, you're right. It can't exist in your world. So I'm not saying
But
that
lots
it
of
does
people
exist.
believe
Maybe it
things that
doesn't.
are not
Maybe you're
true.
right. Maybe you're totally right. And all of this is just a series of chemical firings. That's quite plausible. That's fine. What I have said, and this is the argument that hasn't yet been rebutted, is that society does require an extraordinary number of people to believe that they are capable of making decisions for the good or for the bad. Because, again, not everybody...
So it doesn't, by the way, right? Like, you don't have to believe you have free will to decision make because it's an illusion, right? You can simply sink into the illusion and maybe understand that there is an absurdity there. But also that he's now changing... Now it's like, oh, it requires a bunch of people to believe this thing that's not true, so isn't it good to believe it? Well, maybe, but we'll get there when we get there, Ben. And for what it's worth, like when he was saying that so many people believe they have free will, so what? I mean, most people believe things that are not true. We all know that. Ben, you're Jewish. Most people are not Jewish. Do you believe that your religion must therefore be wrong? No, you think there are things that are true, even if most people don't agree with them? Well, so does Alex.
Is you. Not everybody is capable of waking up in the morning, putting one half of their brain on hold, the side that says what I'm doing today doesn't matter.
Everybody does that.
And we are all going.
Dissonance is something literally everybody lives with. We just don't always recognize it. That's kind of how we live with it.
To wind up in the cosmic nothingness of space anyway, and the sun's going to explode and eat the Earth. Most people don't function that way. And so a functional society, a society that actually works, relies on people actually believing that their fate is in their hands. And the way that people tend to understand that on a
because
day-to-day
again, like, what's the difference between a person behaving in a way where they like, how would someone behave if they believed they didn't have free will? Would there be any real difference? Not necessarily, right? So, okay, why does it
level
change?
is I get up in the morning and I make a decision
now
whether
he's
I'm taking
arguing
my kids
for-
to school today. I get up in the morning
just
and I decide
people
whether I'm giving
believing
charity
things that
today.
are not
I get
true.
up in the morning and I decide whether
Right
to go to
now.
a job today.
You should
Because
be
the truth is that
deluded.
for,
That's his
for a
argument.
huge number of people, and I would say this is true for not virtually all, many, 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 I would say the majority of people, if they were informed since the time they were small that their decision-making process does not exist, there is no decision to be made. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Those decisions have no moral weight in the universe because the universe has no moral weight. There is no way to create a functional society on the basis of these premises.
There is.
There may
by the
be a
way.
platonic
It's that
world where
you
philosophers
just don't have. It just these
can
things
think
are
about
not
this in the
necessary.
gardens of their imagination.
These things are just not necessary for living your life. It's just not needed. Like, it's a crutch that we've used to get along, but people can live their lives without believing that there is a supernatural giver of purpose. Many people have. You're in conversation, Ben, with someone who does not believe that he has a cosmic, supernaturally given purpose, and yet he has a life with which he proceeds. It's clearly very possible. The only way that Ben would be able to explain Alex doing what he's doing is to basically assert that he's lying about his non-belief because he engages in the world, but obviously he's not.
And feel great about it. But that's not actually how society functions, not for children, not for teenagers, not for adults.
And we're going to go on and talk about that in the second section.
Are we just done here? No. Okay. So this is a problem with moderators sometimes. Ben just laid out that there was a second part of this argument, something that we hadn't had the time to discuss because Ben was asserting incorrectly that Alex has some burden to prove that free will is possible. Well, like he doesn't, or that there definitely isn't free will. Or I don't know. I don't even know what burden he was trying to associate with him at this point. But he followed up with like, okay, but it's good for people to believe the lie, which is basically a new argument we just hadn't got, or it's a part of the old argument we hadn't gotten to, and now the mod's going to move them away. It gives Ben the last word seemingly at random, just out of nowhere. Alex should have been able to respond to that because he absolutely can, but we're moving on.
Had free will to ask any of the questions I've had written down here, but I just didn't want to. I didn't want to stop either of you. It's
And
been
yet you did
breathless
anyway.
and captivating. I'm sure you'll agree. Before we go to our first break, we are going to go on and talk about society.
Okay, I saw
and
Ben
how
drinking from the mug,
morality
so he is
undergirds
drinking
society and civilization.
May I just say, just I know we're coming to the end of the section. Just to close off this moment.
Oh,
that
Alex.
If people listening agree
What's
with
up?
me that
Oh, I
free will in
definitely
fact
have not
doesn't
seen this
exist,
part.
and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. You know.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as an insult, but you see what I'm saying, right?
I totally agree. And so for my argument,
Yeah, and so Ben's argument is the atheist delusion they have to believe that free will is possible and then he argues no, we should believe the delusion that free will is possible. Every accusation is a confession.
you would be, and from your argument, I would be. Yeah. Meaning, I think that you are delusional. There's no free will, and you think I'm delusional in the sense that there is no free will.
No. Ben. You literally just argued for people to believe something delusional, because Alex's position isn't that free will is possible only with a god. It is that it is impossible with or without. And so you, who accepted that and had no retort, then went on to say, well, even if that's true, it's really important for people to believe it to get along. Your argument was people ought to believe a delusion because it's useful, not that we each see the other one as being deluded. But he's trying to like both sides this to come off as less absurd.
Well, and yet I believe in it.
Yeah.
Something like
Yes.
that. Yeah.
So for you, Alex,
No,
just
don't
before
agree to
we go
that, Alex.
the break
That's
then,
very different.
Because we're trying to break it down. We've got two insane minds here, really kind of
insane,
grappling.
That's kind of weird.
I feel as though I've won a prize in a competition just to be here sitting with you both.
Nobody's here to listen to
To
you
break
talk.
it down for the viewers, Alex,
I know I'm
would
being
you say that free will is maybe, if there is no such thing as free will, is it nevertheless a helpful fiction for people, a convenient narrative?
Well, that's what they were
that we
getting to,
can
and you interrupted
cling
them.
to sort of bat away despair.
Precisely why it evolved, in my view. I think I totally understand that, but because it evolved so strongly, I will say that we are all, if we are sort of delusory in our belief in free will. I mean, you're quite right in saying that I act as if free will exists in the sense of not constantly being aware that it doesn't. I don't wake up and do those strange morning affirmations that you mentioned into the mirror about, the sort of
I
depth
do
of the
every
universe.
day. Every day I wake up and I say my neurons are firing and compelling me to arise.
Maybe you should.
Every day.
People, I think it is good to reflect on your mortality in that manner every once in a while, and it does inspire some serious thought about whether you're really taking your philosophy seriously. But I will say that the mechanism is so useful and has been so successful in embedding itself into our psyche that we cannot shake it off. So I can convince, I can have conversations with people, as I do regularly,
being
talking
unable
about
to
the
live
existence of
a
free will,
certain way
and they
doesn't
come away
make
saying,
the
you know what,
supposition true.
that's extraordinary, maybe you're right about this. And nothing about the way they live their lives changes, precisely because of the fact that the very argument I'm making relies on the assumption that we will still be driven by our drives. All I'm doing is identifying what's actually going on there, in my view.
Correct.
It doesn't actually change what happens or what the brain indeed does.
So
Fantastic.
the utility argument
Right,
for
we can go to Spinoza's example, right? If you are a stone being thrown, you might find yourself in the air and as the stone and think to yourself, well, I have chosen to fly in this direction. But that wouldn't have made it true. And if someone were to tell you, no, you have been thrown, you might still proceed to fly in the same way, even understanding the mechanism. That's all Alex is doing, is understanding, is trying to understand the mechanism, not trying to say that somehow like can change that people will behave the way they do.
what you're saying about free will is that the main utility in you saying these things is for people not to believe you. In the end.
We are
what?
predetermined.
No, it's that Ben. What the fuck is wrong with you? No, he literally was just saying it's so that people will understand. It's that people understand a truth about their nature that they didn't before, even though there's not really an effect on their. It is in effect now what philosophy, as we've discussed prior on the channel, but understanding it, knowing something about the world, is a positive in and of itself.
To go to a break at this point. So,
But of course, Ben
we're gonna
can't help but
continue
strawman
this.
his opponent.
You're watching and listening to the
Right.
today by Alex O'Connor and Ben Religion and Short
Right.
Break. Our
Short
survey
break,
next
all right,
show.
let's.
Andy Kind. Welcome back to the station from Premier. Is it good or bad for society?
All right, this
And
is
I've
the
been
actual
joined
topic of
by
conversation
Ben
in the
Shapiro
video. Let's go.
and Alex O'Connor.
Oh,
And,
no, never mind. That's not
in the
question.
first section, we
They're
basically
reintroducing.
solved the problem of free will. That's done. No one need write on that ever again. So congratulations.
Okay,
That's another credit for you.
Yeah, I think on the delusion point, we terminated in something like, I know you are, but what am I?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And,
I disagree with
my
that,
dad
but I
can beat
understand
up
why
your dad.
Alex is just
So
not going to pick a fight.
let's move on in this section to talking about another easily solved question, morality and its role in society.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I'm surprised we're
Alex,
still
we
talking
started
about
with
it.
Ben. in
We've
the
solved morality
first section.
years
Let's
ago.
start with
Okay, the mods water glass. No, both Alex and the mods water glasses are lower. We're just not seeing when they're drinking. All right. We can put that to rest. Maybe they're drinking in the breaks.
you.
I'm so stupid.
What for you makes an outcome good or bad? And feel free to
Oh God.
break that down,
Yeah,
define
that's a
things
tough
as you
one.
want. And how do we determine what is good and acceptable in society?
This is going to be
Here's
kind of
where
tough.
I
because
may
a lot of morality comes to your axiomatic beliefs, right? I believe equality is a good thing. For example, someone who is, for example, a Nazi would disagree with me, and we're just never going to see eye to eye on moralistic prescriptive statements because we disagree about ends. And there's just nothing you can really do to argue with that. And on the right in particular, the thought process is fuck you, got mine. It's what is good for me is better than what's good for everyone. If something was good for Ben and bad for everyone else, he would prefer that to something that is good for everyone else but bad for Ben. And like that might seem obvious or whatever, but like really think about it. Like, if like we can put it in context. Like if you had to pay $1 and everybody else in the world like never went hungry again, right? Maybe Ben would agree to that, but I'm not so sure. And that's the kind of thing, like there's an amount to which like selfishness is kind of baked into Ben's political thinking.
disappoint
and
you
moralistic thinking.
and potentially excite Mrs. Shapiro in that I don't have a good answer to that question. In that obviously attempts have been made for a long time to ground good outside of God. I must say that similarly to rehash the same theme, I think there are issues with grounding good in God as well. I don't think that removes the problem. I don't quite know what good is, if it indeed exists. I'm quite suspicious of the concept. I think it might be another one of these unfortunately quite nihilistic evolutionary sort of illusions of a sort. I guess I ascribe to emotivism more than anything, which has sort of gone out of fashion in the past decade, but I think still has some truth to it in a sense.
If you
It's
ever said something,
more
I'll
of a
comment
philosophy of
on it, but he's
language
mostly
than it is a
waffling right
philosophy of what good and bad actually is. What I do know, however, is that there are problems, I think, with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect. That is, I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And what that means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those, inventions, and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral...
Okay, so a couple of thoughts here. One, I think it's really smart of Alex to be extremely vague here. Asking someone to establish the totality of a moral system, top to bottom, is absurd. So the best you can do is something really, really vague. And so it's best, I think, that he was, and we can just talk about the specifics when we get there. But this second part, I mean, so far in this hypothetical he's drawing, I disagree strongly. If someone doesn't believe in God, there are lots of things that you can do to dissuade them. If you're making the argument that they're like single-mindedly interested in doing harm to you or your friend in this example, then like, okay, maybe that's the case, but I think that's the case whether they believe in God or not. His argument, I think what he's getting to is that like the religious believer is you can appeal to like, well, God will dislike this or whatever. But like there's stuff that you can appeal to for someone who doesn't believe in God too, right? You can say like you're wrong. It's wrong because you're causing harm in the world, or the people around you will dislike it, or you'll go to jail, or like maybe if you know the person specifically, you can be like, well, you know, your mom who you loved so dearly and is dead now, would really dislike it, would really disapprove of what you're doing. Like there's so many things people can be convinced by things. It's just such a weird example, and to be like, well, couldn't really convince him otherwise because he doesn't believe in God is weird. And like, why are you seeding this ground? This is the kind of thing Ben will run with. It's I don't know. I just don't get why he's saying
community,
it.
but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal
Okay, that's what he's going the other way.
to me.
Okay, that's fair.
Because there is
Never
no
mind. That's a
law
good
written
idea.
by any man of any time that could ever count one iota.
Okay, I misguessed where he was going with it because of how it sounded. Because it sounded like he was saying, like, the contrast is that to the atheist, I can't really appeal to anything except this stuff. No, what he was saying was, to the atheist, like, you can appeal to a few things, but, like, not much. To a religious believer, if they believe they're sent by God, that's it. Like, you really can't. I also disagree with this. Religious believers are also, like, amenable to, like, maybe you can convince them that God hasn't actually sold them, but like if they're convinced, like he's mostly describing the concept of like being resolute, and I don't know that it's, yeah, I don't know, it's I kind of get where he's doing, but the specific hypothetical doesn't work for me, I guess.
Against the dictates of the creator of the universe.
Oh, and by the way, if you want evidence of this, again, I've talked about this before on the channel, but there's a Christian apologist by the name of William Lane Craig who has on record said, like, yeah, there's an injunction in the Old Testament to kill all the Amalekites, and that injunction has never been rescinded. So if there were any Amalekites around, he would be duty bound by God to kill any of them, to commit genocide. So like, yeah, it's a thing. When the religious really want someone dead, there's not a whole lot that dissuades them.
Or if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates allegedly, of the creator of the universe. It's all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
Yeah. And
So-
this is similar to the argument I've made before about the danger of religion. It's not that there's an inherent, like, this will definitely cause harm. Like, there's a lot of stuff that won't necessarily, and maybe it will, maybe it won't. But the big problem is that it is an approach that relies on certainty on bad reasoning. And so when you arrive at bad conclusions, which are inevitable, everyone does, they are exacerbated and made impossible to dissuade from because they're not, because the approach isn't one that is derived from doing good. It's derived from, well, I was told to do that. It's just not thinking. And when you land on something bad, you can't dissuade. Suddenly reason becomes impossible.
Oh, so many things there, and so much that you're saying is quite brilliant. I actually thought you were going in a different direction with that last.
I also thought he was
example,
going in a
which I'll
different direction,
explain
Ben. He
in a
got me
second.
too.
So, yeah, to
We were
to
both
start
debating.
with the very beginning, obviously, the idea of right and wrong. So there are many problems with the motivism. Alistair McIntyre does a good job sort of breaking down the problems with the motivism. But the sort of idea that there have to be certain moral absolutes that are beyond contention, and those moral absolutes have to be universally accepted. You can ground that, I suppose, in a sort of descriptive universe. The problem is that, to go back to your example, which again I think is
Alex was pretty clear that he's not so certain there is an objective good, but okay,
really interesting one. If a man comes to kill me, I think the real question of religion versus non-religion in the utility sphere here is it more likely that a man is going to come to kill you being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you, or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing?
So this is the no true Scotsman thing. Ben is basically saying the man who comes to kill you is not in fact on religious grounds is not in fact a devotee of that religion. He is, we don't claim him because he's doing something wrong, and it's not, he wasn't actually claimed to do that, but it doesn't matter, right? The question is what he's actually doing in the world. And no, people who are very, very religious, who are very much adherents of their faith, do bad things, and you don't get to disclude them because they look bad for you, Ben.
Is wrong. So if you are faced with these two alternatives, to kind of remove your example one step, the question is why the man has come to kill you. I mean, that's your premise is the man has come to kill you because God told him to, and so he can't be dissuaded by force. Agreed. We see that full scale in the real world on a fairly regular basis. It is also true that over the course of human history, men have come to kill one another on the basis of self-interest in extraordinary amounts of the time. Tribal self-interest particularly, having no particular relationship with God, just the idea that I want to kill you over territory, I want to kill you over resources, I want to kill you because you're not a member of my immediate kin.
Yes, but while there might be so this is something that we talked about actually when we were discussing the Hamas attack in Israel in October. I know I haven't really talked about it since, and I don't really want to. But the point about, I remember mentioning then, there are reasons that people have for these things that are completely detached from religion, but ultimately a lot of people are convinced into it on religious grounds. And so while they're like on a like group level, it is true that it is not because like they think their God told them to. On an individual level, it very frequently is.
Family, or because you killed a member of my kin family, and so in revenge, I need to kill a member of your kin family. The entire, to borrow from your language, the entire sort of evolution of religion on a utility basis would have been to create moral absolutes that are applicable more broadly than to you and your friends. Any morality that can be created on an individual level is inherently dangerous because you can immediately graft that morality onto your personal self-interest. The entire purpose of religion, whether you want to ground...
You just said that religion, people have done this with religion too. In what sense is it? Okay.
That in evolutionary brain functionings, whether you want to ground that in revelation, the entire purpose of religion on a utility level is to remove morality from the purview of my special interest and to say, here are things that I cannot do.
Right? Even in the Old Testament, isn't it kind of convenient that all the people that God told the Israelites to kill were the people who lived in the land they wanted to settle on? Like, isn't that kind of interesting?
They are in my interest because there is a higher power that says I cannot do these things. I think that a society that
and of course, like Ben says that, but also doesn't believe it in that he doesn't adhere to those things. Ben, if I remember correctly, is opposed to abortion being legal in any sense, except Judaism, and he is Jewish, allows for it. So like clearly, your morality doesn't come from your religion. And in fact,
not have these
we've
moral
been over this
absolutes
before.
is in deep trouble. A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances that are universally applicable, it reduces things.
I would put that challenge to Ben. Okay, that there are certain laws that are always like you can, those lines you can never cross and whatever else. I would put to him what the question of the Amalekites, because according to the Old Testament, the only collection of religious texts, or no, I guess not the only one, but like the primary religious text of your religion, Ben, says that you are to kill every Amalekite. Now, that seems at odds with the commandment that thou shalt not kill. How do you square those things? I thought those boundaries should never be crossed. Or maybe it's what I had said before not today, but on this channel prior. It's that people often claim that their personal morality is the will of their God, and suddenly they become immune to criticism. And so the solving of the problem of individual morality, as Ben is saying, is the opposite of the case. It exacerbates the problem. People merely say that it is the will of their God to do whatever it is they want. Like the Ayatollah in Iran. Do you think he does exactly what the Quran says and what he says? No, he does what he wants and says that it's the will of God.
Things that we all take for granted, like equal justice before the law, like the idea that the law is supposed to equally apply to everybody, whether they're a member of your family or whether they're not. And there are broad cultural differences in these questions. I mean, to pretend that all human societies have equality under law is obviously not true. It's not even remotely true, actually.
Wow,
there's a very good book called The Weirdest People in the World, all about the idea that we in the West have this sort of ethnocentric view of ourselves where we think everybody thinks like people in the West. But the truth is that because we are Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, we have particular views of the world. Those views are drawn from a particularistic tradition. That particularistic tradition is biblical in nature. I mean, it is Judeo-Christian in nature.
It's not.
Even if you're just describing European society or American society
it's very
historically
demonstrably
speaking.
not.
So
if you want evidence of this, the one that people love is the Ten Commandments. When people talk about Judeo-Christian values, tell me, is it illegal to commit adultery? No. Isn't that wild?
The kind of removal of God from the equation, your suggestion is that God makes a person impervious to countervailing responses. And my answer is yes, God does make a person impervious to countervailing responses, including the evils of one's own heart, if you truly believe that God is standing above you, telling you not to do that thing. And again, social science tends to bear this out. People who believe that God is above them tend to give more charity, for example. People who tend to live inside religious communities, within the religious community.
Yeah, no, so the thing he was saying about charity has nothing to do with the claim he was making. He was saying that, like, oh, God is above, prevent them from doing harm, and then he went on to say it makes them do good. Those are not the same thing.
And I'm not going to pretend that I think all religions are equivalent in their truth propositions, because I don't. I mean, if I did, I wouldn't be wearing a yarmulke, right? So that's just what it is. Inside religious communities, a lot of social bonds and a lot of social frameworks are built on the basis of this shared belief system. In other words, diversity itself, self-interest, cannot always check self-interest, and it tends to tear apart societies and communities unless there is an orienting goal. That orienting goal traditionally has been performed by church. It's been traditionally performed by the idea that you are serving God together. And
this,
because
of course, what he's laying out here is also mythology, right? Even when Europe was under the purview of the Holy Roman Empire, there were squabbles and fights and different disagreements on morality. It's not like, oh, well, we're all Catholic, so it's fine. That just wasn't the case. It's nonsense. It doesn't actually solve the problem. The only thing that it does is now you have multiple people saying that they speak for God and are unchallengeable. And if they end up winning out, then that becomes the case, and nobody can challenge their individual morality. Whereas, if it's all individualized, if no one can appeal to a God, then you have to make arguments, Ben, and not simply say, well, God said so, so I don't have to talk about it with you anymore.
That people build these social bonds, including the institutions of police for example, to prevent people from killing each other,
Police
because
do
we
not
now
prevent
all agree
people from
that
killing
killing
each
is
other.
wrong, and so we ought to have a third party that
just
we can
not
actually
their job.
give the power to stop
But
to
it's
stop
not
that
relevant
killing.
here.
So again, I think that the question of utility here is one of whether you think that the chief danger is that people are going to believe in a God who tells them to kill in God's name, or whether you think that the chief danger is in man's own heart, and that man is going to be driven by his own self-interest to commit murder and then call
Well,
it
as
something
you've
else.
admitted, even the
I think it's all
religious
very
are
well and
still
good
driven that way.
when this religious tradition is protecting what you think is good. But as we know, it can do the exact opposite, and it can do so with the same force.
Sure.
And I suppose the question we have to ask is whether this is a worthwhile trade-off. That is to say, that there may be some social utility in putting our fundamental ethical assumptions outside of the realm of debate. But when those ethical statements begin to inspire what we would probably consider to be less than socially cohesive behavior, there is nothing you can do, nothing to talk people out of them, precisely because that's where they've placed.
Incidentally, a great example is one that you could challenge Ben on that you couldn't challenge a lot of people who will make this argument, and that's the topic of circumcision. Now, Ben, as a Jew, believes that circumcision is mandated by God. It is part of the covenant, and it is a requisite that all male children be circumcised within 10 days of being born. However, most of the rest of the world recognizes this as mutilation, and Ben would recognize it if it happened to girls, but well, his religion isn't okay with that. And there is nothing I could do, or Alex, or indeed anyone, to convince Ben that I think he has two girls, but if he were to have a son, no one could convince him not to circumcise his kid, because that would be mutilating him. And that's exactly what Alex is talking about. Because he is convinced that his God has told him this is good, he will not think about it, he will not consider it, he will do this thing. And there is no argument that could dissuade him. But of course, he's claiming that that's preferable than people having individual views of things and arguing amongst each other about it. Instead, we can just defer to his magical sky daddy who says we should all mutilate half the population. Isn't that interesting?
And that seems dangerous to me. And it seems, for example, a lot of people talk about how religion can make people happier. It can make people more socially cohesive. It can promote people to start families and have children. This is true of most religions. This is also true of Islam, which I'm not sure you would want to say. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not sure you'd want to say is a force for good in the world. I don't think, in other words, that it's always a worthwhile trade-off. Now,
I agree with you, by the way.
Just because you mentioned how the sort of culture of Europe and its success and America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent revival, it seems.
Not
I
really.
don't really know quite
But,
how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually
he's good too. He's a good
actually
guy.
the great. I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western
it'd be kind of great if Tom Holland, the guy who plays Spider-Man, also started writing books on philosophy, just to add to the confusion, and like have the one who's already writing those books having to put in parentheses, not the Spider-Man guy, not Spider-Man.
civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition.
Yeah, and by the way, like some of these laws that people associate as being Judeo-Christian way predate either of those religions. There hasn't been a society ever that didn't say murder was wrong. I mean, Hammurabi's codes predate Judaism, and they very clearly are like, yeah, don't kill nobody. The golden rule, which was there was I forget who it was. I'm pretty sure it was a rabbi who was asked to like sum the totality of Jewish philosophy, and he said, do not do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. All else is detail. well, that was written by Confucius at least by just him thousands of years before, or maybe not thousands of years, but well before Judaism. Like these aren't they don't come from these religions as much as they claim to.
A society that today, I'll expand on this if you like. A
Please.
society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society,
Yup.
wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun.
Oh,
wrong
and by the way, like Ben, you are also only somewhat religious. Now I don't know the extent to your religiosity, but you are clearly not Hasidic, which is, as I understand, the most religious sect of Judaism. Maybe there's more that I'm not familiar with, but you are at the very least less religious than they are. You're not wearing the prayer shawl. Well, maybe you are. It could be under your clothes. You don't have your sideburns grown out. You haven't grown your beard. You work on Saturday. Well, you might not work on Saturday. Okay, but like there's a lot of stuff that you could do and you don't. But you think this is an acceptable level of religiosity. But why? God told you to do these things. You're not doing them.
wrong about the age of both of those celestial
It's almost
bodies,
like it comes
wrong
from
about
you.
the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal, on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property.
And Ben, there is absolutely nothing in the Old Testament that says even hints at the slavery being wrong.
Now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. That is, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man.
Well,
Rather,
that
she should
you
remain
can't really
silent.
ascribe
For
to
Adam
Ben.
was formed
He's
first,
not
then Eve.
Christian.
And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the Sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution, which he authored, was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find.
And what Alex is doing here is pointing out like this consistent history of religious people who will claim the good of religion, ignoring all the wrong that religious people have done, but then wanting to take credit for all the good that any religious person might do, irrespective of its relation to their religion.
Find it funny if it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments
Except that-
against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, so I would buy that, except for the fact that many of the people that you mention in these contexts explicitly counted themselves as religious believers and were speaking in the name of the religion while they were doing it. So to take the abolitionist
What?
movement as an example, I mean, William Wilberforce, obviously a tremendously
You're
religious
literally
person
doing the thing he
and
just
a big
said.
believer in the New Testament. Isaac Newton, obviously deeply ensconced.
Right, but Ben, what he's saying is that it is never contrasted by people like you with the opposition. That while the abolitionist movement in the United States had a lot of religious people who were arguing on religious grounds for abolition, the people they were arguing against were arguing also on religious grounds for maintaining the institution of slavery. But you only want to claim credit for the abolitionists. Why? Because they won and you agree with them.
in the New Testament, right? Yeah, certainly important to the scientific revolution. The point about religion, and this is why when I wrote my book, I have to name the title now and plug myself because that's the way
You
that
got
it
to
works.
wave
The right side
around
of, yeah,
on
the
the
right side of
camera.
history. But the reason that I talked about how reason and moral purpose made the West is because I think that one of the fundamental precepts of at least Judeo-Christian religion is that when God gives a text or a set of ideas to human beings, he expects us to use our reason to apply to those texts.
Does
and
he?
so the sort of evolution of interpretation is part of the religious tradition. I mean, that's always
Okay, so now what Ben is doing is he's saying, well, we're supposed to interpret and use our reason to apply to these texts, and therefore, not everything is necessarily like we can reject slavery even though God says it's cool, but then Ben, at what couldn't someone use their reason and reject all of the text and still be religious? What is fundamentally different from adhering to one prescription as opposed to another at that point? The problem is that religious thinking requires that you must accept all or none, and if you accept some, then there's no reason why can't someone accept the kosher laws but not the injunction against theft? What would be wrong with that? Oh, it's because you have to use your reason. Suddenly we're back to the individual argumentation thing. Suddenly the book does us no good.
Been the case in my religion anyway. So I can only I always hesitate to speak on behalf of other people's religions because I don't know them nearly as well as I know my own. So when I talk about sort of the application of reason to tradition in the religious tradition, obviously we have books and books and books of texts discussing and debating these very ideas, and the idea of religious debate has always been central to the idea of Judeo-Christian religion, and when it hasn't been, it's been seen as repressive and
and that's also not true. Debate is extremely common and kind of the lifeblood of Jewish theology. That's like huge there. He's completely correct there. But he said Judeo-Christian. In Christianity, debate is anathema. They have gone out of their way for centuries to make sure debate could not happen and fight against it when it does. It is very new that debate is acceptable in Christianity
than other Christian movements that then argue with the original movement and end up
Yes.
generating in almost Hegelian fashion some new form of interpretation. The point that I'm making is that outside that framework, it doesn't exist. Meaning that
What?
if the argument is over interpretation of particular biblical verses in a context in which there is a God who puts certain moral precepts beyond human
Also,
judgment.
like, I love how he's wanting it both ways, right? He started with there are certain precepts, these lines you do not cross and cannot cross because God said so. But simultaneously, we can argue about which precepts we ought to adhere to that are in the text and apply our reason. It's nonsense. It's double talk.
Judgment. Those arguments you can have without threatening the entire social structure. What is very difficult is to have a social structure at all in the absence of fundamental moral precepts that are presupposed by everyone. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing a sort of revival of this idea that
and
religion...
it comes into conflict when he says exactly that, right? Certain moral precepts that are accepted by everyone, except they're not. There are some people, or we'll take the abolitionist example. There were some people, quite a lot of them actually, who said, no, God said it's cool to have slaves, and so we'll keep doing it. And the abolitionists definitely didn't agree that was how we ought to proceed. And now the abolitionists were right that there ought not be slavery, but these two groups of the same religion had differing ideas on this precept, and so you don't get to claim this uniformity. And if you did, you would be, even if you do want to claim it, you'd have to acknowledge that if the abolitionists, like, if I don't know, if the South had wanted, if like slavery had maintained, that you would be on religious grounds bound to argue for its perpetuation. Like, you might say you wouldn't, but you'd have no, like, why should it apply this way and not another? We don't have a reason. We just have, well, you like this one now.
is very important to the West is because one of the things that we have seen is that as religion has become less important to the West, we've seen declining birth rates en masse. We've seen rise.
So, first of all, declining birth rates aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's possible to have too many children. Also, correlation is not causation. We've seen declining birth rates because of industrialization. The wealthier a country gets, the fewer children people want to have. And if people want to have fewer children, fine. They can have fewer children. But he's saying it's a bad thing, and he's implying that it's because of a decrease of religiosity.
Rises in suicidal ideation. We've seen
rises in suicidal ideation. Is that because of the decline of religiosity? Or maybe is it because of the increase of wealth inequality and wealth disparity in the world? This is a time of worse wealth disparity and wealth inequality than we've seen in quite a long time. Maybe that's why people are feeling more depressed and more suicidal. Maybe it's also having to do with social issues of alienation and isolation. Could be a lot of things, but he's implying it's a decrease in religiosity.
Especially over the last 10 years, tremendous individual atomization, certainly an extraordinary amount of less social connection. Right? All of these things are things that, frankly, used to be provided by church and these social institutions that, again, were oriented to.
Church did not provide higher birth rates, Ben. Now he's talking about the social stuff, but obviously, like, Ben, church did not provide higher birth rates.
For a single purpose. So when you talk
People
about
didn't
the
go to
idea,
church and be like, all right, let's make a kid right here in the pew. I don't think that was the thing. I don't think that's what people got up to.
that I'm going to put aside the free will discussion because I think, again, it's easy to get caught up in the reversion to the argument that I was making before when you were saying that, can you argue the man out of stabbing you? To use your framework, I mean, you can't argue him out of doing anything. I mean, you're going to say
What?
the words are going to have an impact, but you can't argue him out of doing anything.
What?
Not
Yes,
not to
what
get
the
back
okay.
into a topic that we've handled.
He's
Free will is
just
done.
dominating
But
again.
the-
I'm not gonna.
Alex explicitly said that people react to, like, the whole argument is that people react to external factors. To claim that he's saying that you cannot argue someone out of anything is literally the opposite of what he said.
Answer that.
Also, just the way he was looking, really, like, head down and all that, it looked like the shadows made it look like he had eyeshadow on, and like that look, it seemed very sinister in a very cool way.
Though hopefully people will know from what I said before that I think it's still sensible to say you can argue somebody out of something. The first half of what you say there is in so many words, I think, what I was saying before, which is that, yes, this goes both ways. That is, thanks be to God when he is able to provide us with the grounding for resisting oppression and throwing off tyranny.
Yeah.
But what about when the same God is used to justify the exact opposite?
Right, but you're going to. The
all I'm
point
saying
making
is that this
you're-
goes
you're
both
going-
ways.
I-
And
go-
we'll
but
never
going-
know.
But you're going to have to weigh in one side or the other,
We'll
meaning
also-
that in terms of utility, right? You're building
Yes,
a
By
society.
the way,
Let's say
I can't help but notice that this is what, the third or fourth time Ben has either attempted an interruption or, in this case, finally succeeded with one, whereas Alex has not. It's because Ben cannot have someone speak their mind and have his position stand.
that I won't say you're God. Let's
And
say
now
that
we
you
even
are
like
master
talked over Alex to the point where he got to continue even though Alex was midpoint.
of a society, and you get to build that society.
Mm.
One of the things that presumably you are going to do is you're going to build in certain things that are untouchable, right? There's going to be certain moral precepts that you're going to build in that
Yeah.
are untouchable.
But here's the problem
and
with that.
how are you
Some of
going
those
to
things are gonna be
justify
wrong.
those things to people such that they are going to believe you? You're going to either
argument.
have to use compulsion,
I don't-
or
I
you're
don't
going
know
to
if I would
have to
do that.
use some sort of other argument
argument.
that is
And
so
Ben,
strong.
your argument is the compulsion of a deity who demands that you behave this way and do not think about it. By the way, Ben, we're all Americans. Oh, I guess Alex isn't, but like you and I are Americans. You should be aware more than most that is not how a good society is built. The American Constitution is a living document. It is designed, intended to change. There were things that were written in the text that we said, no, that isn't going to apply anymore and shouldn't. And that was a good thing.
that they are going to overweigh their self. I mean, there's a reason why Voltaire suggested he didn't believe in God, but he hoped that his maid did, so she wouldn't steal the silverware.
Yeah, that's an interesting indictment on the position that theists don't say that atheists can't be moral, right? When people have this argument about morality,
Atheists can certainly be moral.
well, oftentimes people have this misunderstanding of the argument. Christopher Hitchens did it best in saying, we don't need divine permission to be good and all of this. Fine, but as you say, you don't need to believe in God to be good, but you need to believe in God to ground that goodness. But then when you sort of casually throw in this statement by Voltaire, I don't believe in God, but I hope that my maid does. That implies that actually maybe you do think that without the belief in God, somebody isn't going
no,
to
I
act
think that
morally.
Voltaire thought that he was good, meaning that Voltaire was an atheist and thought that he was good. But his point was sort of back to the Straussian Platonic point.
His point was that he hoped his maid believed in God because without that belief, she wouldn't be able to act morally.
Right. So because again, when we're arguing on the basis of broad societal
So Alice is
utility,
completely correct there. Ben was implying the argument that it requires a belief in God to behave morally, but of course, he is going to continue to run from any solid claim. Notice he's done this every time. He has not made any substantial claim, and as soon as he has made one that Alex can point to, he runs away from it. He's doing it again.
one of
He's
the
a coward.
things.
He refuses to make
I
an
happen to be in the happy position of being able to argue that what I think is socially useful also happens to be true.
Mm-hmm.
The question I'm asking you, and I think that's what a lot of this conversation is whether you think that what is socially useful is actually false or an evolutionary illusion. And I think that's kind of the position that you're taking, unless you want
Alex
to
would
argue
say
that
it is
generally
not
speaking,
socially
religion
useful.
is either not evolutionarily
necessary.
adaptive, which would be a hard position to actually take.
Well, I think it must be, otherwise
clearly.
it wouldn't exist.
Or you would have to argue that it's, even if it's adaptive, it's of no general benefit to humankind or is an illusion, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Or you can argue that it has outlived its usefulness. That maybe it was adaptive and was useful, but its usefulness is declining and diminishing. That's also potential. But he's trying to force Alex into certain boxes. His whole bread and butter as a debater is straw man, is straw man misrepresentation, so on and so forth. And so he's trying to force Alex into a straw man here. He's giving him the illusion of choice. Which of these things that I have put in terms that make it seem ridiculous do you want to hold to?
that's the position that you're taking. So one of the things that I'm enjoying about the conversation is that I don't think either of us are going to argue each other in anything, but it is clarifying what exactly the lines of the division are.
Yes, to backtrack a moment, because you said more than one thing in what I just responded to. You also mentioned, you talked about Isaac Newton being a Christian. So, I mean, people were astonished discovering his private notes to find that he spent more time talking about theology than he did science. This is certainly the case, but I do think it's worth pointing out when people like to notice that the originators of the scientific revolution in particular were believers in God. There are a few things to say on that. First, we don't know what Galileo thought in his heart of hearts. And part of the reason for that is because despite tripping over himself to say, now look, I don't think Scripture is wrong. Now look, I believe in God and I am a Christian and I believe in Scripture, but maybe the earth orbits the sun. His life falls apart. So suppose he did secretly have doubts about the existence of God. Do you think we'd ever have even found out about it?
And that's an unfalsifiable argument.
I think not a chance.
Hilarious, Ben, that you are now aware of unfalsifiable arguments when you're making religious arguments, and you've already made several arguments that were designed to be unfalsifiable. But the point Alex was making is that it is impossible to know because there was such extreme coercion, external coercion on people to at least appear religious, that to claim them as religious, it's kind of weird, right? When everyone is compelled to do something, to say that they are is like, well, he believed it. Did he? We don't know, and you can't claim him because he didn't have a choice. Even when he outwardly said that he believed, saying something that appeared to be a challenge, as Alex said, ruined his life.
In other words,
but the lack of falsifiability makes it difficult for me making a counter argument.
In other words, let's not be so.
Maybe he did have a secret diary, but I have no proof that he had a secret diary.
What I'm saying is, let's not be so confident about this. The second thing to say is that these men, if that's what they were remembered for, that is their theology, then they wouldn't be remembered. Thirdly, is that just on the minor point that people often like to point out that, well, the originators of the scientific revolution were religious, and so science can't conflict with religion. I'm not going to make the claim that science does conflict with religion in principle, but supposing that it did, this would not serve as a rebuttal, because if it were the case that the scientific revolution and the scientific method undermines religion, then of course the people who invented the scientific method would themselves have been religious, because they hadn't invented the mechanism by which it came to be undermined yet.
Yeah,
it
but
would
then
be like
afterward
saying,
they presumably would be irreligious or a-religious,
It
which is what happened to Darwin, for example.
it doesn't happen that
necessarily,
quickly, right? It really
That's
doesn't
not true.
happen.
On an individual level, it certainly
If we're talking about
happens.
the development of the scientific,
This is what a moderator ought to be for. Ben is the only person who's been interrupting. He's been doing it mid-sentence multiple times in Alex's statement now. He even glanced at the moderator like, "Are you gonna stop me?" Maybe that's not what he was thinking, but dude, this is not a conversation wherein people have been talking over each other. Why are you letting Ben get away with it? And it's to the point where twice now Ben has interrupted and talked over Alex until in a way that made Alex stop so that he could proceed. Do you want them to argue or not?
Of the scientific method. We're not talking about the kind of thing that just happens in a lifetime. I mean, to attribute it to Galileo and Newton as we happily do is far too simplistic. This is something that happens over at least decades.
Right,
and
but you're making
hundreds of
both an
years.
individual argument and a broader historical argument. So
Yes.
pick one.
And so what I'm saying is that the individual beliefs of the founders of that revolution, I don't think that revolution would have gotten off the ground enough from just their contributions within their lifetime to shake decades of prior faith. However, when you get to someone like a Darwin, then we start to see agnosticism. Then we start to see people having their doubts. And then when you get into the modern era, atheism abounds. And so, in other words, if it were the case that this thesis, which, like I say, is not something that I'm defending here. I'm just sort of rebutting the rebuttal to it. That is, if it were the case that the scientific method were this king of undermining religion, then I think we would expect the fact that those who invented it to have been religious. It would be like saying, isn't it amazing that the person who invented the motor car didn't own a motor car before that?
Well, no, because again, you've now also made the case that perhaps they had secret diaries, or in their heart of hearts they weren't
Nope.
actually religious or convinced
did not.
away from that. So again, that's why I'm saying I feel like you're making a broader historical argument that works, and I think you're making an individual argument that doesn't quite.
I'm not saying
Meaning
that is the case. I'm saying that we would never know because why is that? Why will we never know what Galileo really thought about religion?
Well, I'm going to
Answer the
just
question,
accuse
Ben.
you of assuming facts, not in evidence. I mean, like,
Let's move it.
First of all, Ben, you of all people shouldn't be saying that. But no, he asked you a question. Why will we never know that? The point isn't that Galileo definitely was an unbeliever. It's that if he was, we couldn't know that. And so to claim his membership as a believer is one of those, like, in a way, you're making the unfalsifiable argument. I could not demonstrate he was an unbeliever because it was impossible for him to be one at a time where he might have lost his life if he was.
Because again,
Galileo.
you're, like, I don't want to get into the mind of Galileo, nor do I care very much. But the reality is that many of the people who were the progenitors of the scientific revolution and participants in the scientific revolution specifically were searching for something higher because they thought that was their godly duty to do so.
Yeah, see, now you're making the positive claim. We definitely do know, and Alex is asking, it had tried to ask, well, why is it that we can't know? But you don't want to answer that.
I mean, this has been true since the time of Roger Bacon. I mean, the idea that you have people who are specifically seeking out the nature of the universe because there's an understandable, again, another religious precept, there's an understandable universe that God has created, and your mind is a reflection of certain truths that are in that universe. These are all non-materialist atheistic concepts. That was the basis for virtually all of science, including the origins of the scientific revolution. Now, you can make the argument very easily. I mean, I make it all the time because I have to metaphoricalize the beginning of Genesis, for example, that the words of Genesis don't jibe with the words of science when it comes to the age of the universe, for example. And obviously that's true, which is why both Maimonides and Aquinas are talking about in the Middle Ages the idea that if science comes into conflict with religion, you're either getting one of them wrong or you're getting both of them wrong. And so the constant sort of reinterpretation of religion in light of the facts that are established by the scientific method, I don't think that that's a rebuttal of religion. And so
is it not? And your God said a thing happened, and we've determined that that's not true. Is that not a rebuttal? Okay.
More than that, I think that the peculiar idea that religion itself must fundamentally be undermined by scientific discovery, I don't see quite why.
Well, I would agree with that. I'm just saying that the rebuttal that's presented to that opinion fairly commonly, I don't think works for the reasons that I've.
This is kind of unnecessary. Like, I was thinking this when he was arguing against it before, but this is kind of not worth arguing, Alex. Basically, what's happening is that Ben kind of was arguing against something that Alex hadn't said, which is the claim that science undermines religion. To which his counter argument, the argument that Ben presented, even though Alex hadn't said that, was to say that the founders of the scientific revolution were themselves religious, as if that means anything. And Alex was arguing against that claim, but he's been explicit that he doesn't believe the former. So, like, I don't know why we're here. You should focus on things that are more important.
That I've said.
Okay, well, let's give you both a little breather because we're going to go to another break very shortly. We fitted in so much, and I had all these questions, and I haven't asked any of them, and I'm worried now.
We're
I'm
here
gonna
for
be
them,
left
not you,
unemployed.
I before we move on, I don't know if I can have one final word on this Galileo point, because I know it seems quite strange that I'm.
Okay, I will give it to Alex. He's been really good about, like, getting this last word in, especially because, like, in the first section, Ben, like, presented an argument they hadn't gotten to yet, and the moderator tried to end the debate there. And then here he had been talked over so much that he kind of needs a chance to speak his mind. So he's been pretty good about, like, kind of wrangling a last word, given that he has been in situations where he kind of needs it.
Hypothesizing in this way, but you said that when religion and science come into conflict, either one is wrong or both is wrong. Galileo was wrong about one of these things potentially. what happens if I mean you can it's great talking about the utility of his religious belief in inspiring his scientific endeavor, but what happens when the immediate fruit of that is him discovering something which should have been a celebrated idea and instead was suppressed, and he ends up under house arrest in Tuscany for the rest of his life? Why? Specifically because the religious authorities, in their sentencing of Galileo, did not just say that he failed to prove it, did not just say that he was, being a bit of an a-hole in his approach to things, but said specifically because it is false, absurd, and contrary to Scripture. That is why that scientific position was suppressed on specifically religious motivations.
And far be it from me to defend the Catholic Church and its crackdown on Galileo.
Okay.
You've come to the wrong place for that.
Okay,
trying
it's
to say,
time
but,
for
yeah.
you.
This is why, I think Alex ought to have directed his specific examples to more Jewish examples, because Ben can very easily just say, like, well, I'm not a Christian. You can't really do it. It doesn't really work the other way, because Christian debaters will do kind of have to own up to stuff that's in the Old Testament. It's part of their religious text as well, but Ben very much does not have to condone anything from any Christian church or whatever, because he's just not a Christian. And so this is why, in this case, it doesn't really matter, because the point Alex is trying to make doesn't require Ben to be a believer. But this is why I was making giving some of the examples that I was of putting up, he can't really dodge these. They're in the religion that he is a believer of.
It's time for another break here. You
here
are
it does.
watching and listening to the big conversation from Premier Unbelievable. I am almost anonymous here, Andy Kind, but my day will come. And I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. We'll be talking about religion and society. Is religion good for society? So much more still to break.
Right.
Good.
I
I know
agree.
you're society, and we're having a lot of fun with it, I think.
I agree. We are having
I
fun.
know
Aren't you
you're- I
having
know
fun?
you're sort
I'm
of
having
in
fun.
disagreement on things, but I think we're just having fun with it today, aren't we?
As ever.
I've been joined by.
I
Ben
will say, by
Shapiro
the way, I
and
think Alex did a
O'Connor.
lot worse in the second.
And as I
part
say, we're
than
talking
in
about
the first
religion
one, though
and
I
its
think he
role
still did fine.
in society. One observation I've got from watching you guys talk, I wonder whether religion is being used as a bit of a catch-all term. There is no summer festival where Ben and I would meet up because we're religious and have a beer together.
Well, you say that, but Ben is someone who has, throughout his career, but also in this conversation, gone to bat for the term Judeo-Christian values or Judeo-Christian origin or whatever else. He is actively trying to combine the two, and I don't know if the moderator is Christian, but it's likely, and if you are, then there you go. Ben is trying to create that umbrella.
Plenty of Buddhist people don't even believe in God. So we probably don't have the time to unpack it now, but religion is maybe not a helpful catch-all term at all points. I wonder whether, when we're saying religion in this context, we mean the Judeo-Christian worldview. But it's interesting,
because we've been keeping an eye on the glasses,
Christian,
because I'm very, very stupid, and I noticed that their glasses had also been refilled since the last time we saw them. Maybe that's why I kept getting confused in other interviews. They cut away when someone's drinking and refill in the break.
Lots of things I agree with Ben on, some things I disagree on. Lots of things, as an Englishman, that I agree with Alex on, and other things that I wouldn't.
Spelling.
So, yes, spelling, absolutely. It's aluminium. Anyway.
No,
I just think
incorrect.
That's
Aluminum.
interesting.
Get it right.
I'm not trying to start.
How
this
did the Brits
theist
manage to get their
gang
own
and
language
gang up
wrong?
on you, Alex at all? But what do you think quickly about that? When we're talking about religion, do we need to be more semantically sort of accurate?
Rigorous, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, again, I'm not here to defend every form of religion under the sun. There are various forms of religion, ranging from things that people in Judeo-Christian tradition would consider pagan.
Boom, there it is, Judeo-Christian again. Yes, he is trying to combine that. So while the moderator's we would never go to some summer festival, Ben is trying to lump you two together as a political force in the same regard to get his political ends that he claims are religious ends sometimes. The separating them out, yes, has usefulness, but let's not pretend that they do not get combined at the very least as political forces.
To Judeo-Christian monotheism, to the distinctions in Judaism and Christianity, which are substantial, obviously. And so, I do believe that there are right forms of religion or righter forms of religion than others. If I didn't, then I wouldn't be a particularist in my religious practice or my religious belief. And so I do think that you're right to sort of boil down the question so that people don't end up defending things or being forced to defend things that they wouldn't defend. I mean, you mentioned before Islam. I'll say more radical forms of Islam because, again, I'm one thing that I tend not to do as a religious believer is simply take people's texts at sort of face value, because the reality is that very few people in religious circles take their text at like the I can just
Right,
pick up
but
a
then
Bible.
at that point, right, like then at that point, what does a religious believer believe, right? It's just what the individual believes. Remember, Ben, you were the one saying that the benefit of religion is that you don't have people trying to figure out right and wrong for themselves. They have this source of like lines that cannot be crossed, as you said, But if that doesn't come from the book, where does it come from? How can we know it? In what sense is it anything more than the individual? Or I guess it can be the group, but it's not. We can't have a way of knowing anything. I understand that religious believers don't believe everything in their text. If I asked most Jews, they would not say yes, they ought to kill every Amalekite if we found any alive today. But the point is that that there those prescriptions exist, and the fact that they're at the moment not being focused on is happenstance. If in 10 years there was a movement, there was that a religious movement that decided some of these passages are now super important, well, then I guess we'd have a problem. And if you don't think it's random, I'd like you to note that while the Westboro Baptist Church is very, very insistent on homosexuality being a sin, it says it's an abomination in the Bible, the next paragraph talks about how eating shellfish is an abomination with no less vitriol, and yet they're not out there protesting Red Lobsters. What if they decided to? Like it's happenstance.
Bible, read it. Now I know everything that's going on in the Bible. Value that really is not how the practice of religion works. I tend to actually judge faith by faith practice more so than I do by trying to read somebody else's book and then figure out exactly what they're saying, because I've seen people do that enough to my.
This is also not true, Ben, because Ben has been very Islamophobic in the past. I'm sure he keeps doing it, but I don't pay attention enough to Ben to know how much he keeps at it. And if you look at religion in practice in the United States, Muslims are fine. They're fine. They're like everyone else. They just happen to be Muslim. That's about the only difference. Maybe sometimes they have different dietary restrictions, just like you have different dietary restrictions. Sometimes they wear different clothing, just like you wear different clothing. Ben is literally wearing a yarmulke. Like, it's really not that weird. But Ben is like I'm sure Ben is in the camp of genocide the Palestinians because some Hamas guys uh, uh killed people. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to delegitimize, like I don't want to minimize. I realized as I was saying it, the people that were killed by Hamas, I mean, that's terrible. There's no I don't want to minimize that, but the point is, like, Ben is very clearly willing to associate he's said very, very racist things about Palestinians and about Muslims. But in practice in the U.S., they're fine. He's lying.
Religious practice to sort of object to it. But yeah, of course, I think that you would have to talk, if you're going to talk about the value of religion, you should be more specific. I will say that the value of religion more generally, if you were going to talk about it in just general terms, meaning belief in supernatural things that can't be explained by a materialist universe, the social cohesion point would be the best case in favor of religion, is that virtually every study ever done has shown that social cohesion relies on a common orientation among people in order to build commonality between people. There are really only a few structures in human history that do that. One is a kinship structure. The problem with kinship and tribal structures is that they pretty quickly devolve into tribal warfare upon other
a thing that's never happened with religions, right, Ben? Okay, I don't have to say it. Yeah, like I was going to lay into that, but then he's like, here's the problem. The thing that definitely religions never happen. There's never fight. Religions never fight.
members of different
Don't worry
tribes.
about it.
One of the things that religion has done is an attempt to universalize that beyond the immediate sort of tribal self-interest that we discussed a little bit ago.
Yeah, religion's never
and
ever.
again, pretty much universally, social science
definitely agree
suggests
with Ben on this one.
that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, that provide us friendship structures, marriages, that a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it. And so
that's, by the way, completely not true. So friendship is the really easy one. Some of these things he's correct, and the solution isn't to go back to religion. I don't think it's to develop more of these mechanisms by which people can. But people have friends from all sorts of ways. One of the things I noticed is like, in fact, when I did go to to church, um, when I did go to like religious events and whatever, those were not the people I was friends with. The people I was friends with were the people I went to school with. That is the structure that I think a lot of people use. Now, people are very frequently not friends with the people that they went to school with. That doesn't tend to be like a long-term thing. Not always, anyway. But it often can be. But then there's also work. There's also your hobbies. People can find friends. There's a problem of loneliness, and we need more of these structures. But like to say, well, we ought to engage. We ought to believe in religions and like go along with all the negatives that are associated with it because there's a problem that used to be solved with religion that we need a different solution to is nonsense.
The sort of breakdown of those structures, you could make the case, I suppose, for the breakdown of those structures, but there's been pretty much no replacement for those structures in secular society, and it's creating some pretty significant strains
Right, and so his
on societal
is
bonding.
not
Great.
to
So
I do
let-
have
I'm
two
gonna ask-
things to
I'm
say.
going to ask you. Yeah, I want
say.
you to say both of those things, but I want to ask you, Alex.
Oh,
can
okay,
secular societies potentially achieve the same level of social cohesion as religious ones?
Potentially, maybe. I don't know. That seems to be an empirical question, insofar as we can have empirical data on social cohesion as a
Yeah, I don't know
subject.
how you would answer that question.
Wanted
other than what
to,
Alex
I
said.
suppose, in response to that question, mention the history of the United States as a constitutionally secular nation. Presumably, the discussion there devolves into whether America can be described as a Christian nation or not. But based on what you just said a moment ago, before we maybe get into that, you said, of course, we need more specificity is hardly ever worse than less, and that you're not trying to defend all religious traditions. And then you say, but look, this idea of there being a God and there being an unalterable authority and a moral author of the universe is itself valuable, and without it, there are all kinds of societal discohesion
right,
comes
yeah.
about. In that case, for example, I wonder, and I hope it's not a crude question, and it's one
Well, let him get to it.
sort of stemming from genuine interest. Would you rather your child comes to you and says, you know, I think I'm going to convert to Islam, or said, I don't think I believe in God anymore?
Okay, so that is a good point Alex made. Is like, yeah, Ben was like, yeah, well, we can't just lump them all together. It's all different. But at the same time, like, religion is just a good thing because it is like this. So he had it both, wanted to have it both ways. But this challenge is one that Christopher Hitchens used to pose to people, and I think it is a good one. We know Ben hates Muslims, and so the question is, yeah, which would you prefer? Someone be your child converting to another religion, which you just made the argument for being better than being atheist. But that religion is one you hate and you think is like, and you clearly despise the people who are adherents of. Or would you rather them be atheist? And like, Ben can say Muslim, but he'd be lying. But if he were to say that he'd rather his child be an atheist, then, well, doesn't that kind of demonstrate that he thinks there are things worse than being. He thinks there are things that are better than being religious, and that being religious isn't just an inherently good thing. And it really depends on which we're talking about. And when we get to the discussion of which we're talking about, suddenly we have to start figuring out right and wrong, irrespective of the text of the books, to figure out which book or which faith, since he wants to separate himself from the book, which faith has the precepts that are the most that have the most good in them. At which point, why do we need the religion to tell us what those things are?
As a Jew, I'm fairly indifferent on the question,
Incorrect.
meaning that my priority is for my child to remain a Jew, and which direction they go from there is of much less interest to me than staying inside the religious tradition that I believe is correct.
Okay, maybe I should rephrase to say, suppose
He's
that,
also lying about that.
half of the U.S. population immediately, right now, and half of, let's say half of the Christian population. So it's not to do with
Right.
Judaism, and it's not to do with your own family.
This is a good rephrasing. I would
Half
not
of
have
the
thought
Christian
to
population in
rephrase
the
it
United
this way.
States are immediately going to convert today to atheism if you press this button, or to Islam if you press this button. Which one would you press?
So I'm
I
gonna ask
definitely
for-
would not have thought to reform it in that way, but that is brilliant, right? Now we separate it from, well, Judaism's not an option, and we're not talking about your children. Do you have a preference between these? And it puts the same problem to him that he tried to dodge before. Hello?
for more specificity
Sure.
in line with the conversation. So which form of Islam are we talking about, and which form of atheism are we
Shia.
talking
It
about?
doesn't
Because they
matter.
come in various
You hate
strains.
them
But
all.
meaning like, if we're just starting from the premise of no God or Islamic God, that actually is not enough information. Because as I say, I'm not judging people
Yes.
based on their faith propositions nearly as much as I am based on their behavior, which I think they base on faith propositions.
Okay,
say this
so
is
like Ben has never been like Ben has conflated like Muslims and Palestinians before. This guy does not care if the difference between the sects of Islam as to whether he has the one he likes and the one he doesn't. But that's why I immediately was like, fine, Shia. I don't know which is more popular, which is more prevalent. I know between Shia and Sunni there's one that's more prevalent, and I don't remember which is which. It might be Shia, and so like whichever one's more common, there, that one.
The only thing that changes. You press this button, half the Christian population become convinced that there is no real God of the universe. Everything else is random. Whatever you might, because what we're discussing here is essentially what,
But yeah,
what are
Ben
the
is not going to be
implications
able to
of such a
dodge his way out of
worldview?
it.
What are the implications
Alex
of
is very
atheism, which is
capable
just the
of
disbelief
refining to get around
in God,
these.
or the belief that
Do
there is
people have
God.
memories? Sorry, in this hypothetical, do people have memories or they don't have memories? Because this makes a difference.
They have
doesn't.
memories.
Okay,
But
fine. So
okay.
then probably in the West, atheism, as opposed to a more radical form of Islam. That's why I was asking for specificity.
Well,
Because they're more
the button
moderate
on the
forms.
right-hand side was going to be that they just become convinced that Muhammad is the final prophet of God.
Right,
That's it.
and again, I was going to ask for more specificity on that because I know many
Yeah,
moderate
we know you
Muslims
are, because
who
you wanted to-
are not
you don't
radical
wanna answer
in
this
the
question.
implication of their faith, as opposed
But
to
answering
some who very much are
atheists-
quite radical in the implications of their faith. So, but let's, if you don't mind,
As I said
I'm
before.
going to set up your hypothetical in a way that I think is more clarifying for me
Please.
anyway, and that is button on the right is radical Islam, like Taliban style Islam.
Okay.
And button on the left
Well,
is
yeah, but no. So it's more clarifying for you because because you get to dodge the question. The point that Alex was making is that like you seem to think that like, well, I guess this kind of works because like you were making the argument, Ben, that basically having a religion telling you the good, what is good, is inherently valuable and good, and it doesn't really like you're treating it as all the same, and so you would have to say that yeah, like believing in Islam, no matter the version, because you hate them, is worse than being an atheist. So like to put it in the obvious, like, well, obviously I'm not going to pick being member of the Taliban over being an atheist. It lets you dodge the real problem there, for you anyway, on an optics level, because like the reason that you pick the atheist over Islam, and the example that Alex just gave, is not because you think is like a directly in contrast with the argument you were making, but it doesn't seem like that when you're just like, well, I don't like terrorism.
don't believe in God.
Well, I mean, you can do that.
No, the reason I'm doing that is because that elucidates a difference that I think is being obscured by the simple sort of belief in God, not belief in God.
Oh, I forgot to point out why this still kind of works. The reason why this should still kind of work is because the argument Ben was making is that the value of religion is that it gives you a source of like, we're all on the same page on morality. So yeah, it shouldn't really matter what that page is. So he ought to say they rather than convert to radical Islam, if as he wants to put it. But he did that with the less inflammatory one, so it doesn't really matter.
Question, meaning that the cultural heritage of that's why I asked if people have memories or people don't have memories. If people have memories, then that looks very much like secular Europe right now, which does have
The cultural
in the
heritage of
bloodstream
Judeo-Christian
a lot of Judeo-Christian values in a way that
Yes.
would not be true.
Well, I'd want to
if-
put to him then, like, if they don't have the memories, then would you prefer them convert to Islam? Would you prefer them to convert to radical Islam rather than being an atheist? Because like that's kind of insane.
you were without memory, right? Would I rather that a child found in a forest be raised in a moderate Muslim household or be raised in a secular communist household?
or a secular atheist household. if you
Yeah,
want to say.
what the fuck? Why are you introducing
Again, from which tradition? Are we
communism?
talking in the USSR? Or are we talking in Britain? Like, what are we talking
We're talking
about
about
here?
Britain.
Okay, so we're talking.
Well, we were talking about the US, but let's say Britain.
In Britain, depends on the strain of Islam. If we're talking about like a liberal form of Islam, which do exist, then probably a liberal form of Islam. If we're talking about a fundamentalist form of Islam, then probably a secular strain of Britain.
Fine.
So
The second
suddenly,
point-
like, so this gets to the point that Alex was trying to get to, right? Like, suddenly, it's not that religion is inherently valuable because it gives us all a shared sense of morality, because clearly you think that certain senses of morality are worse than having none of that, which you assume an atheist would have. But shouldn't that be the opposite of the case? Or and as I was saying before, like, well, if uh, if we're going to be determining which ones have the correct set of morals and which ones don't, then clearly we're not looking to these religions to figure out what's right and wrong, and we don't need them.
point was to say, I mean, you mentioned not wanting to just to take scripture at face value, and I understand the difficulty of taking scripture essentially out of context and trying to take a literal approach where a literal approach isn't supposed to be taken. I mean, people forget that the Bible is a collection of books rather than a book with lots of different
With an
genres
oral
inside
tradition
it.
and all the
I
rest,
saw
yes.
I saw a video once of somebody trying to use the Bible to disprove the divinity of Jesus by quoting the book of Job, saying, "God is not a man that I might question him." God is not a man, you see, and I thought not only is this in the mouth of Job, but also that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid. But it does seem to me
that
that
is
there
kind
are
of funny.
some
That is really funny. In case you didn't get the follow up, the other problem with that is that Job would be speaking metaphorically. He's to say God is not someone with which I can disagree, like I could disagree with just another person. If Jesus were divine, then that doesn't make him like the fact that he took human form wouldn't make him not God. It's basically like Job would then say you shouldn't argue with him either. That's right. It's completely missing what the metaphor is.
things within religious scripture that do need to be taken seriously and do need to be taken essentially at face value. That is some of the very specific legalistic commandments of the Old Testament, for example, or of the Hebrew Bible, I should say. These are not, when people list these and say that these are potentially morally problematic and may have done something towards hindering, for example, like I mentioned earlier, the abolition of slavery in the United States. Of course, there was a great deal of religious influence on both sides, which is something that I've already mentioned. But don't you think that this problem could have been solved a lot more easily if there had been a stronger religious tradition of opposition to the ownership of other human beings? Why can't that have been the case?
Okay,
because
so-
Scripture quite explicitly condones it.
Right,
And in fact gives you the details of how to do
Yeah.
it.
And this actually kind of gets to something I left on the table when Ben had said, like, let's say we were going to we're going to found a society. You would want certain things to be permanent, unchangeable. These things are always the case. Well, part of the problem is that I, like anyone else, like the writers of these books, am going to get things wrong. And when I do, I want it to be the case that they can change. If I wrote down, like, I don't know, like, what's something like, I don't know, like, if I wrote down the minimum wage of a person should always be this amount, well, that should change with time. I would have gotten that. No, I wouldn't say that, but like that would change over time, and for that to be permanent would be really bad. I want that to be changeable. Now, obviously, there are things I think that should never be changed, like the injunction against murder. It should never be the case that murder is considered acceptable. But unfortunately, there's not really a mechanism by which I can know perfectly whether a thing is good or bad forever. I believe the things I believe, and maybe I might want them to be forever, but if I'm wrong, I want them not to be. And so it doesn't help. This is one of the problems that religion has. People wrote these things down. They thought they were okay. They thought they were good, but they were wrong. And the fact that they're wrong is something that we're still dealing with. But Ben wants to say, no, they were just always right.
Yes.
That's something that couldn't have been done, in other words,
This
because
is fun
you've
for me.
taken
Now I
this.
get to
Oh,
tell
and
me-
by the way, if for Ben to say like they were always right, you would have to say like that slavery is cool then. But he doesn't think that, so he thinks you can argue with some of it, but now you lose the whole thing of these things are unchangeable and perfect, whatever else. He does like Ben. I don't know if Ben thinks adultery should be illegal, but if he doesn't, what's with that? That's in the 10. By the way, for Jews, the 10 commandments are not special. They are the first of like 500 something that all have the weight of commandment. So why he should reject some and not others, why he should prefer the 10 to the others, it's arbitrary. It's the thing that he was complaining about, individual decision making on what is right and wrong, as opposed to coming from some divine source. You don't have it either, Ben. You just pretend to.
Talmudic law. So
This
here's,
moral
here's
principle
the,
that's placed outside of meaningful debate.
Right.
Before we move on, can I ask, where are we getting these buttons from? Are they from Amazon? You know, you press
Really?
one and
This
everyone's
is
an
what-
atheist.
There's this wonderful thing
Moderator,
These
that,
are
shut the
available on
fuck
the
up.
market.
that I think
Holy
we both need to use in this conversation, which is imagination.
Oh, right.
so let's as far as why didn't the Bible prescribe the perfect world as I would see it, or as you might see it? And the answer is because two reasons. One, as stated right up top, I'm not God. I assume he has different logic.
He's gonna wave his hand. I don't have to explain anything. I don't get how God works. Don't hold it to anything. That's answer number one. Let's go.
Than I do. Two, the Bible is in an inherently problematic position in the sense that, on the one hand, it's trying to divulge important truths for all time. At the same time, it's talking to a people of a particular time.
Yes.
And this is
the cope
a
that people
well-worn
have
tradition
invented recently.
inside Judaism. So to take the slavery example, there is no mandate to hold slaves in the Bible.
No,
there are lots
but
of
it
mandates
says
in
it's
the Bible.
cool, and this
many,
is how
many
you
mandates.
should do
There's
it. And there's
613 of them,
definitely no like this is when it should stop.
according to my religion, right? That's why I do all these weird things that I do. But one of those mandates is not to hold slaves, right? And so the idea
It's
of
not.
there was a society
That mandate is if I know if there might be a different passage, but if it's the passage I'm thinking of, it is not to take slaves from not to make slaves of other Jews. It's not to not have slaves. If that injunction were there, this wouldn't be a conversation. There wouldn't have to be rules about like how to make them. In fact, there are certain injunctions to take slaves. It wasn't with the Amalekites. It was with some other group that were supposed to be genocided. It was saying to take the young girls who are too young to have known a man for yourselves. That's the sexual slavery that Alex was talking about earlier.
that existed at the time of the Bible in which slaveholding was not only ubiquitous, it was universal, and which was true for virtually all of human history.
That's right.
And could be justified not just in terms of religious scripture, but in terms of Aristotelian thought.
Now he's just like, this is the song and dance of like trying to, it's not just religions, it's not just us. No one said it was. The point is that your religion says it was cool. So this is completely irrelevant.
Right. I mean,
Yes, not gonna argue
the
against
great
it.
philosophers
Completely
we like to cite sometimes in the secular tradition are big fans of slavery, and that's true virtually up until
What's secular
the 18th century.
Yes.
So the idea would be: is this verse attempting to woo people away from a tradition of slavery or to humanize the slaves?
Nope,
Or
because
is it
it does
attempting
not
to
actually have that
reinforce that
mandate.
by making it harsher and more difficult? And that's why actually one of the things I enjoy doing in terms of how I study the Bible, for example, is I like to look at contemporaneous religious texts of the time. So I
Yes.
like to study the Bible alongside, for example, Hammurabi's Code. And it's really interesting to notice the differences and where the Bible is liberalizing Hammurabi's Code, for
Yes,
example.
absolutely.
And so the idea that
That is a really interesting version of study, and I think like I have to imagine that this is what happens in like higher level university courses, but if it doesn't, like that seems like a thing that should happen for religious studies. That does sound really smart. To his credit, that's a really good idea.
divine revelation has to be given to human beings who are capable of following that in the time. Again, that's part of the difficulty of I think rebutting religion in a certain sense, because again, it seems wiggly, but it really isn't, in the sense that if you believe, as I do, in a God who spoke to human beings in some form or fashion and has to speak to them on a level that they can understand, in ways they can understand, then that immediately
Yeah, but
is
like
going to
that God also made mandates about these things do not do these things, do not do, like God was clearly capable of making strict and clear injunctions against things that like if they weren't doing them, then why do you have to have them? Things like wearing mixed fabrics or planting two different crops next to each other or eating shellfish or whatever. Like these prescriptions presumably were necessary because it's the kind of thing people would do. So why not prohibit this other thing that people would do? Clearly the ability to simply forbid something is there. Why was this thing like they just couldn't handle? They were too dumb to understand that like another thing should be illegal, or maybe the people who wrote it, who weren't God, thought it was cool and didn't have a problem with it.
to discount the ability to do a lot of very radical things that would have appeared radical in 1200 BC, but now appear to be commonplace.
Oh, and by the way, it wasn't radical. Slavery had like there have been a lot of instances of abolition of slavery in different levels. I think Cyrus, that's the grandfather of Xerxes. So like this would have been a long time ago. I guess Judaism predates him, but like I think it made slavery illegal, or maybe Xerxes did it. I don't know, but like there's been a lot of abolition attempts at abolition of slavery over the century and millennia. It's not like radical. It wouldn't have been like the first time that someone suggested it, and it wasn't like absurd up until the 1800s. It was just mostly absurd in Judeo-Christian parts of the world, Ben. Almost. Yeah,
Yes,
anyway.
I understand this argument, and I've heard it many times. I must say that it seems strange to me that God does seem willing to completely and utterly condemn a bunch of other
It's
practices,
the thing
including,
I
by the
said.
way, imaginary crimes like witchcraft,
Yup.
just done away with entirely. And
Or do you
even if
think
it is the
witchcraft
case
is
that
real,
God,
Ben?
for some reason, couldn't even hint at the idea that maybe eventually we should be moving towards
Yeah,
the
like
abolition.
that's why I was saying, Alex, I love you, man. That's exactly what I was saying. But like, yeah, why couldn't it have said like, okay, you can, this is how you should treat your slaves or whatever. And by the way, one of them is like, it's okay, like if you beat your slave and he gets up after a few days, it's fine, it's cool, just don't kill him. So like, it's not exactly compassionate. You could have just been like, hey, don't beat your slaves. That would be a thing they could wrap their head around. But it even says, yeah, like thou shalt take no new slaves ever, and like this way slavery will be done with in a generation. It doesn't say that either. Or like, well, I guess it wouldn't, because then like birth, like, or in 1,000 years thou shalt free all your slaves or whatever. There's no end date. It's just like, it's cool.
Of the idea of owning human beings as private property. He just
I'd
had
say
to
he hinted
condone
at
this.
it, but yes.
I still think it's the case that he would not permit a flat immorality, and I think you would agree with that too. And so when I open the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and when I look at the texts saying that if you lay siege to a city, you can kill, if the Lord delivers it into your hand, you can kill the men and the women, but keep. Or you can kill the men and keep the women and
He's
the children and
referencing the same thing.
and the livestock as plunder, as Deuteronomy says. And in the very next verse, the very next chapter says that, if you see a good-looking woman, and I'm not interjecting that. If somebody finds an attractive woman,
Yes, Ifat Toar is the actual Hebrew, yeah.
then they can take them for themselves, and if they want them as their wives, and they take them home, they shave their head, they cut off their fingernails, they give them 30 days to mourn their old husband, who you may very well have just killed, and then you can take them as your wife. When Numbers 31 has Moses instruct the slaughter of the Midianites, saying, kill all the men, and this time the women get killed too, but not the women who haven't slept with a man.
The Midianites, that's what it was. I couldn't remember. I knew it wasn't the Amalekites, but yeah, it's the Midianites
Might that be? And it says that
Yeah,
keep them for yourselves. And I hear all the time that this is some kind of liberalizing process. Maybe it's because these people wouldn't survive on their own. It's some kind of protective measure to make sure that you're looking after them. If that's the case, then why does it only apply to the virgins? That seems a little bit suspect to me. It's sort of Scripture's littered with these kinds of.
Well, again, so to go back to the sort of oral tradition nature,
and I don't think
God
would permit a proactive immorality, even if he can't, for some reason, abolish the practice altogether. If you see what I'm saying.
No, that last point I don't see. So when you say even if he can't abolish the practice altogether, well,
which already
no,
I think he would be able to do.
Right. So the question is whether he can or whether he can't. If he can't abolish the practice,
yeah, God is all powerful, but he can't tell people not to do slavery. Cool.
The idea of wooing people away from a particular type of sin through a gradualistic process is known throughout society.
But again, like the injunctions aren't that, for what it's worth. There's not a process of like, after 50 years don't do this anymore. After 100 don't do this. That's not there. You're implying that because the history of the world was such that Jews tended not to own slaves because they were conquered so many times that they just weren't in that position. But that's not the same. That's not God saying, well, we'll get rid of it eventually.
Across human history. I mean, the gradualistic processes are the way that most things get done across human history. And by the way, the universal practice, unfortunately, up till today in many places in the world, is in fact...
But like, your God was very able to stop certain things immediately, like wearing mixed fabrics. Or were they already doing that? In which case, like, why does God have to say it?
The extreme version of what you're talking about: raise everything, kill everyone. That sort of stuff, unfortunately, does take place, even on planet Earth, even in the year 2023. And so, the idea of a culture arising from the Bible that not only abolished slavery on its own shores, but then abolished slavery literally everywhere else, which is what Great Britain did. that again to separate
They
that off
didn't
from a tradition
also,
that
for
also
what it's
says
worth.
that every human being is made in the image of God, right? Which is the verse from Genesis, or that you
Yeah,
have to
like look at the extrapolation. They have to look for every human is made in the image of God. Like for what it's worth, slavers considered black people non-human, so that wasn't that compelling to them. But um, but look, like that's what you have to look to for the argument for abolition. But the argument for slavery is God says this is how you should do it. So clearly it's cool. In what way is this an indication towards gradually being rid of it?
treat the stranger well, right, which is repeated more than any injunction in the Bible, right? There are these traditions that are at war with each other inside the Bible, which is why there is this hotly fought kind of argument inside biblical circles about all of this stuff, which again is one of the reasons why I said right up top that when it gets to I can't just open the Bible and interpret the text as I would see fit and say, well, I don't like this verse right here.
Contradictory.
But you do that, Ben, because you don't have the.
You say that Scripture is contradictory?
Well, I say that Scripture is some Scripture is time bound and some Scripture is not.
And we can know
So
this
the easy one the sort of easy way to distinguish is that when the Bible.
So like our kosher laws, like you don't have to keep them anymore. I think Ben keeps kosher. If he does, then like what? Those are like we can get rid of those too, right? Why not? But like by what mechanism can we determine which ones are time bound and which ones are not? Maybe the injunction against murder is time bound. Is it? How do we know?
Bible says not to do a thing, then that tends to be non-time bound.
And when it says to do a thing,
And when it says to do a thing, that may be a temporary permission structure, but it could also be a wooing.
Okay, that's actually a pretty reasonable answer to that question. I'll admit that's pretty reasonable. I'd have to think about my counter argument to that, but like ultimately, like that is kind of arbitrary, right?
By the way, again, I'm not speaking out of turn here. This has been 1,500 years of Jewish reinterpretation of Esha Yifat Toar, to take a quick example, right? The War Bride, the long-standing Talmudic tradition, which again is almost 2,000 years old at this point, is that was deliberately an attempt to avoid mass war rape, which again, you can scoff at that, but mass war rape happened on this continent 70 years ago when the Russians literally raped everyone as they came into Germany. So these evils continue to exist in the human heart.
even if this was a liberalizing force, and even if this was not as bad as other slavery, do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God commanding something which you now see to be, or rather permitting something and explicitly and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
Because he's not permitting me, permitting my great 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 great
To do something
grandfather
immoral.
to do something
Immoral.
that in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered
Well,
immoral,
God
but was it
considered
immoral?
it immoral.
By today's standards, by today's standards
who's
that
the
were
moral
developed by the
relativist?
Judeo-Christian tradition,
Does
sure. By
do
today's
God's
standards,
standards change with time, Ben? Like this is your source of ultimate morality, homie. If God is like, well, it's immoral, but you can do it, it doesn't matter that that it's by current standards that we think it's immoral. Unless you think God doesn't find slavery immoral, like pick a lane.
is developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition immoral.
So
which, by the way, you're living off you're again, not to get back to the Tom Holland argument, you're living off the remains of this. I mean, where's
Which
your
is what you
morality
think,
coming from?
But who's the moral relativist now? I mean, it seems that a moment ago you say that the great success of religion is providing a sort of untouchable moral basis that sort of transcends human affairs and human debates. And now when I say, well, look at this, open your own religious scripture and look at this blatant immorality, you say, yeah, but well, that was considered to be fine at the time. It's considered to be bad now by the progress of Judaism.
And like, where's the bright line, Ben? Like, why is it bad now? Where was the point at which it stopped being? Where's the point at which it stopped being bad? And how could we possibly know that? What if it was bad then and will be bad 1,000 years from now, but it's cool now? Do you have a way of knowing?
There's a question.
Who's the moral relativist?
Well, it's not relativistic to say that a thing that is wrong today is considered wrong today because of a tradition that developed over time.
The question I'm asking is not, was it considered right or wrong at the time of biblical slavery?
It was wrong.
Was it wrong?
It was wrong then to hold a slave. Yes, it was wrong then to hold a slave, obviously.
Okay, so
And
God
also,
said
if you are
it
God
was
and you are
cool for
pragmatically
these
attempting to
people to
move
do
people away from
something
slavery,
wrong.
was it a practicable thing
Here-
to simply quote unquote abolish slavery, or
Here's
is that
here's an
in
idea
the
for
religious
example.
tradition?
By the way, it was a practical thing. Other societies did it.
the book of Exodus, God says, I think in chapter 21, maybe 22, says that if you have a Hebrew slave, you are to let them go after 7 years. If that Hebrew slave comes to you with a wife, then after the 7 years, you let them go too. If you give the Hebrew slave a wife and they have children, then after those 7 years are up, you give the man a choice. He can go after the 7 years, as per, but you keep his children and his wife. Or, and here the scripture says, if he says, I love my wife, I love my kids, and my master, as if that's going to be one of the principal considerations, then he can stay with you, at which point you take him outside, you pierce his ear like cattle, and he becomes your property for life. Now, here's a suggestion, for example.
Yeah, and so here's the thing. How does that deter... My thought to that passage, which I have heard before, is, okay, so now what if this continues into perpetuity? Children upon children upon children upon children. In what way, at what point does this end, Ben? You said it's supposed to end gradually over time. When does it end? When someone decides to be let free? Or actually, do those... I don't know what the thing is with those children. Are those children just yours forever, in which case this isn't a problem anymore? Like, isn't that very clearly a mechanism by which this can continue indefinitely?
If it was already established that Hebrew slaves go after 7 years, and it's already established that if they come with a wife, they can go after 7 years, then if I give them a wife and they have children, would it not be, it doesn't seem to me particularly revolutionary. It doesn't seem to me the kind of thing that would have caused such social discohesion that God just couldn't have found a way to do it, to say, well, why not let the whole family go free after
And
those
that's
7
also a
years?
good point.
With the knowledge beforehand that if you give this Hebrew slave of yours a wife and children, they'll get to leave with them. That seems to me, for example, a minor improvement that would not cause this kind of revolutionary earth-shifting, he couldn't have just gotten away with slavery.
Why
Maybe
not
that's
make it
true.
a little bit
But
better?
something as obvious as this to me, it seems that if that is the case, that could have easily been done, then the failure to do so and the keeping of that Hebrew wife and their children as the master's property, that itself becomes an immorality that is dictated.
If I
from the
agree with your
heavens.
premises, I agree with your conclusion. I think that the question as to how much social discohesion would it have caused to do a thing is an open question. I think the other question that sort of
So
remains...
you think it was so, like, the implication of that statement is that maybe it would have been so radical to suggest that you should just let them all go no matter what, that it would have been, like, thrown society into chaos and therefore was impossible. I don't buy it, Ben. And of course, that's why he's not saying it. He's only implying maybe that was the case. Who knows?
Open here is the incentive structure as to whether you accept a wife from your master. Right?
I don't think you have a
I don't want to get
choice
into
in
the
that
abstruse. I mean, we can do
circumstance.
this
And we
literally
need
all
to-
day.
we need
and
to
there-
step from the
there's-
past into
I mean,
the
there's 70
future anyway,
volumes
so-
of the Talmud that are literally about this sort of stuff, and then copious writings in terms of reinterpretation.
Yeah, we're hardly the first
Okay,
people
sure.
to talk about
Yeah,
this.
exactly.
This is
This is not the
pretty-
first time these questions have come up. But I think the general point is sort
If you
of one
need
where
70 volumes of writing to answer this question, you don't have an answer to this question. Just be clear.
either
about
we
that.
can dive into that full time and you can spend your life becoming a rabbi, which, enjoy.
happen. Could
It
happen.
Could
Never
you
say
have
never.
the
You already
beard
have
for
the beard.
it.
Hey, Ben, we got
your
him.
beard is further along than mine. Or we can sort of, stipulate at the top that there are certain biblical interpretations that are abstruse and difficult, and that has been a reality of religious life since the beginning.
Well, I can agree with that.
So
That's
we need
certainly
to
true.
we need to step from the past into the future through this conversational portal that we've got available to us.
Where does that portal come from? Did
Obviously,
you get it from
everyone at this
Amazon?
table
Sorry,
would agree that holding
this
a slave
moderator has
is
been
wrong in the same
upsetting
way
me.
that the man you kept talking about who you thought was coming to kill you, we would all agree that that's a problematic thing. And it does seem, so I'm not going to get you to defend this because I want you to come up with another game show where you solve the future problems of society for us, Alex. It does seem that on an atheist worldview, it is difficult ultimately to say what is good, what is right, what is wrong, but we can be practical about it, we can be functional about it. So come on then, for the future, give us some practical secular philosophies that can really help to build social cohesion for the future. You've got about a minute to do that, then we'll give Ben...
Here's 1 minute. Solve an insoluble social problem that's existed for centuries. Go!
to respond,
Well,
and then we'll wrap up.
I can provide an answer that I don't think will be cause of further debate, which is to say,
That'd be shocking.
Yeah.
I think everything that I've heard you say, Ben, on this subject, and everything that I think you may be about to say, not everything, but some of it, involves saying that, look, what we need to do is encourage strengthening family and having children and not doing drugs and all of this kind of stuff, which people, like you say, have traditionally, this has been somewhat the prerogative of the church to maintain. I think that people just don't believe in God anymore, and so what I would say is just to encourage those things without the God. The question I would leave, and I'm sorry, I've just promised no debate, but here's something. Look, suppose it's the case that I agree wholesale with your proposition that religion is good and maybe even necessary for society in some way, right? Suppose I just say that that's true. I don't believe it's true. I've tried, I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. And so, I'm now left with a choice here. I don't think it's true, but I become convinced that it's somehow useful or beneficial. What am I to do with this information? You can't just choose to believe in God. People say you can choose to act as though you believe in God. That's kind of true until something really testing comes along. If you don't really believe it in your heart, you will falter at the first opportunity. How am I to raise my children? Am I to lie to them? Am I to say, well, I don't believe in any of this nonsense, but because I think it, promotes a sort of non-replacement.
This gets back to what Ben was saying at the first section, where they walked away saying like, oh, I guess we're both just saying the other one's delusional. But no, Ben was arguing in favor of maintaining a delusory belief, not merely that one that Alex Alex is saying is his view, but one that is necessary. But Ben was basically saying, well, it's useful, so isn't it good that people believe it? And now the question of like, okay, now so what? Like, we try to believe something not true. We teach our children lies. Isn't that harmful in and of itself?
Birth rate. Then I'm just going to bring them up believing things that I think are false.
Yeah.
I don't think this can happen. It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into.
Oh, and by the way, Ben would have to admit, like, he tries to lump the Judeo-Christian thing, but if anyone pushed him on like, well, Judaism and Christianity are different, and started making all these arguments about like Christianity being useful for society, Ben would never ever turn around and say, well, I guess I should tell my children to be Christian and I should convert.
Utilitarians on this question that outgo the idea of being, truthful and being honest and talking about things that you think are philosophically sound. Now it's essentially faith-based, and it's about trying to make as many people, the greatest good for the greatest number across society and societal cohesion, even if you think it's false. In other words, I'm someone who is an atheist. I don't believe it's true. If I just grant everything you've said about the utility that religion provides, what am I to do?
So let me ask.
You've got about 30 seconds.
So I mean, it really it's a quick question, which is, do you know it's not true, or do you not believe that it's true?
I don't believe that it's true.
You believe that it's not true, or you don't believe that it's
I
true?
believe that it's not true.
You believe that it's not true in a full fashion.
Let's say that's the case, yeah.
Right. So if you believe that, then obviously I think that you're wrong in the sense that, as I said right at the outset, I think that a lot of atheists are more religious than religious people. Religious
you're
people
wrong, but
constantly
that's not the point.
admit to doubt.
Notice like he immediately distracts from the question. He's answering something completely different just so he can throw a dig in. This does bother me when it's like, oh, the atheists are more religious than religious people. Or is religiosity bad all of a sudden? No, it's just because they like accusing their opponents of doing the thing that they do. It's the accusation being a confession again. It's not true whatsoever. But it's also irrelevant. If Alex had said, okay, I just believe it's not true, or like I don't believe it's true, it doesn't really matter. The point is the same. You do not, when asked the question, do you believe this is true, you do not answer yes. And so now but you are told, it's good for your children to believe this, so are you going to teach them this thing that you do not believe?
And problems in interpretation and all the rest of this sort of stuff. I don't think that a true religious believer can be truly religious without experiencing those doubts, because you're taking a leap of faith right off the top.
Atheists experience doubts
and
too.
what I would normally say to somebody who is not fully committed to disbelief, I would say, is that you'd be in the position of being able to say to your kid, I don't know if it's true or not, which I think is a more honest answer,
yes.
By the way.
Well, you think it's more honest because you're a religious believer, but obviously other people disagree with you, and you haven't answered the question that's being put there. I can say, sure, I don't know if it's true, but you're saying it's important for me to tell them that it is true.
I think that is something that you can teach your kids. You can say, here's an atheist perspective, here's a religious perspective. I don't know what's true. I can provide you evidence on my side why I don't believe it fully, but there are people who provide evidence on the other side and arguments on the other side that that are not foolish, that are not out of the sky crazy. Like and so the
Yeah, I
and
mean, he's kind of implying here that it's wrong to teach to raise your kids without telling them what religious belief, like about religious belief and like and giving them evidence to support it. But what if you don't believe it, Ben? What if you think it's lies and nonsense? According to you, it's good for society. Am I supposed to teach them things I believe are untrue? I don't care if you think it's wrong. I'm asking you if it's your position that it is better to teach people things we believe are false because you think that they're real.
and make your own decision. I think that's the way that you would address that with a child. If you're somebody who believes in the social
And you can't
utility of
demonstrate
religion
them
but
that
doesn't
way.
necessarily believe in the religion itself, I think giving the child the ability to choose that themselves by saying
Yeah,
I'm not
let
sure
them pick.
or by
Yeah, let
presenting
them
both sides
pick
of the argument would not be a
religiosity.
bad way to go. I mean, just in terms of practical solutions. In terms of
By
what
the
I
way,
would,
the people who want education like this, especially in schools, tend to be atheists. Atheists, when people talk about religious education in schools, religious people want kids taught like, oh, Jesus is the Messiah and he was sent by God and yada yada. Atheists want, there are people called Christians. They believe these things. There are people called Muslims. They believe these things. There are people who are atheists. They don't believe these things. Like that is a kind of religious education that atheists tend to support.
would say to better society, I have a much easier answer, which is I think that you should re-engage with your social institutions, including your church.
But
I think that
is he going to answer the
saying
question?
to people on an individual level, don't do drugs, study hard for your tests, get married before
Completely off
you have
topic.
kids, get a job. Like it's easy to say that to people, and I think that without supporting social institutions that reinforce that nearly every day and make it part of the culture that surrounds you, it's very difficult for people to live that. And so I think that removing God as sort of the capstone of these
And he
institutions,
just doesn't answer the question.
the whole institution tends to fall apart. So on a practical level, if you get rid of God, the institution just ceases to exist, and you can yell
It's
as
just
much as you
not
want,
true.
but individuals are far less likely to provide the social reinforcement and social networks for support that actually create the bases of a good, fundamentally solid civilization.
If you want evidence that this isn't true, from an atheist perspective, there isn't a God, and yet we have all these things anyway. It's that easy. But notice he hasn't answered the question. The question was, if I think these things are not true, if I believe they're not true, okay, I get you think they're wrong. You haven't answered the question. You think it's beneficial if I teach children things I think are lies. Do you think that should be the case?
Than an individualist civilization in which all you can do is basically encourage someone to quote unquote do the right thing.
Amen. Well, the fact
Yeah,
we've
just
managed to
doesn't
keep
answer
Ben
it.
Shapiro within the 24 minutes is a miracle in itself, a miracle that Alex doesn't believe in. But we have been talking today on the big conversation about religion and whether it's good or bad.
I just want to make sure we
for
don't miss
society.
anything else.
And I've
But
been
I think
joined by
I think
two
it's wrapped up here.
literally world-beating minds, Alex O'Connor and Ben
world-beating? What does
Shapiro.
that mean?
I have enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much to
Okay,
both
we're
of you.
done.
You're both
It was very interesting as a conversation. I'm glad we watched it. I think Alex did a great job here. He is, as I say, extremely good at exactly this. Ben, I don't know. He's Ben, right? Like he's not a good debater. He doesn't know how to argue, but his rhetoric probably came off really good to a lot of people. He probably seemed like he was really smart, seemed like he knew what he was talking about, even though he didn't. And everything was full of holes. He refused to hold to almost any position. He ran from testing questions for the things he even would agree to. Yeah, just not a whole lot there. Otherwise, I'm glad we went over it. It was a whole bunch of fun. I hope you enjoyed it too. I'm gonna get going. I got some stuff I gotta take care of. I'm already running a little bit late. So thank you all so much for watching. Oh, I forgot to mention, updated stream schedule. I'll post this when I get around to it. Probably gonna be like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday for the foreseeable future, and probably move Magic to being on Fridays. I should have said that at the outset. We'll say it again tomorrow. It's fine. So a little bit different just because my work schedule changed. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will catch you next time. Bye.